There are no stars here, no maps to mark the way. Out in the deep, beyond the borders of any known system, there is only the silence of forgotten space. The colony, tucked in this dark corner of the galaxy, seems nothing more than a dot on the fringe of a greater design. Its people live simple lives, unaware of the whispers that echo beyond their isolated world. And yet, beneath the quiet, beneath the daily routine, something stirs. Something that will not stay hidden for long. Lena sat in her small, dimly lit laboratory, a place far removed from the hum of the colony's daily life. Her hands rested on the cool surface of the desk, fingers tracing invisible patterns as if searching for meaning in the grain of the metal. A cup of tea sat untouched beside her, its steam long faded. Her eyes, though tired, were focused on the holographic screen in front of her. She replayed the data again, for what felt like the 100th time, as if the raw numbers could somehow give her a different answer. But they didn't. The results were always the same. Her son shouldn't have survived. The accident had been unremarkable in its brutality. A fall from the cliffs during a day trip, a sharp rock piercing his side. Lena had been too far to stop it, too far to do anything but run toward his crumpled body and feel the weight of the universe collapse around her. She could still hear the distant hum of the waves against the shore, mocking the stillness in her chest as she cradled him. There had been blood, too much of it. His skin pale, lifeless. She had seen death enough times in her work to recognize it. She had prepared herself for the quiet inevitability of his loss, the kind that seeps into every parent's nightmares. But then he had breathed again. It wasn't a gasp, not a cough, but a slow, steady breath that filled his lungs, even as her mind told her it wasn't possible. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, and then with a clarity that chilled her to the bone. The wound had sealed itself, as if it had never been there. She had checked his vitals, searched for the sign of trauma, but there had been none. It defied everything she knew. It was beyond medical explanation. Now, weeks later, the data she'd collected from that day lay in front of her. Cold, unfeeling lines of code that said the same thing. Her son had regenerated. Not healed, regenerated. It was not natural, not in any way that medicine could explain. It was something else. Something she couldn't ignore, but also something she couldn't yet understand. She knew what it meant, though. She knew that if anyone outside the colony found out, it would change everything. Humanity had spent centuries clawing for a place in the galaxy, always one step behind the older species, the ones with lifetimes that spanned eons, the ones who shaped the laws and borders of the stars themselves. If they knew what her son had become, what they might become, it would bring a reckoning. The aliens had always regarded humans with a mix of indifference and curiosity, their short lifespans a curiosity, their ambitions a source of quiet amusement. Lena had always found it patronizing, the way the other species looked at humanity as though they were children in a game too complex for them to play. She had never believed it herself. Humanity had been growing, adapting, and surviving long before they ever encountered the first alien race. But this, what she had discovered in her son, it was different. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Lena looked up, startled, but said nothing as the door to the lab slid open. Sean, her husband, stepped inside, his face lined with concern. He had seen the same data. He had been there when their son had stood up, brushed the dust from his clothes, and smiled like nothing had happened. He didn't say anything now, but his presence was enough to bring the unspoken weight between them to the surface. "He's sleeping," Sean said quietly, his voice measured, like nothing ever happened. Lena nodded. The silence stretched between them, filled with the questions neither wanted to ask. "What are we going to do?" he finally asked, sitting beside her. His eyes were tired, but steady, focused on her. Lena shook her head, the weight of the question pulling at her. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice a whisper. "I don't know if we can do anything." "We can't keep this hidden forever," Sean said, and there was a heaviness in his words that made Lena's chest tighten. "If anyone finds out?" Lena didn't need him to finish the thought. She had already played out the scenarios in her mind. The moment this secret slipped, it wouldn't just be about their son. It would be about all of them. Humanity, fragile as it seemed, had always been underestimated. This would change that. They would be seen as a threat, a wild card in a galaxy that prized control above all else. The other species wouldn't allow it. "I need more time," Lena said, her voice firmer now. "I need to understand what this is. If it's genetic, if it's something specific to him, or—" Her voice trailed off. She didn't want to finish that thought either. The possibility that this was something more, something that could spread, hung in the air between them. Sean's hand rested on her shoulder, grounding her for a moment. "We'll figure it out. But we can't keep this from the colony forever. They'll start asking questions. They already are." Lena sighed. She had noticed the looks from the other colonists, the quiet whispers when she walked through the settlement. They knew something had happened, even if they didn't know the full extent. Rumors had a way of spreading, and out here, in the isolation of space, rumors became truths far quicker than anyone wanted. Before she could respond, the lab's comm system beeped. A notification flashed across the screen. Lena frowned, pulling the message up. Her fingers stilled as the words appeared, her heart skipping a beat. "Anomaly detected. Unknown vessel approaching colony perimeter." Sean leaned closer, reading the message over her shoulder. His face darkened. "Who could that be?" "No one," Lena said quietly. "No one's supposed to know we're here." The colony was far from any major trade routes, hidden away in the folds of uncharted space. It had been established precisely because it was off the grid, a place where humanity could survive without interference from the larger galactic powers. The fact that an unknown vessel was now approaching could mean only one thing: they had been found. Lena quickly brought up the surveillance feed, her breath catching as the image of the approaching ship appeared on the screen. It was sleek, with a design unfamiliar to her. Alien, definitely not human. It wasn't broadcasting any recognizable identification codes, and it wasn't following any of the standard protocols for contact. That was enough to tell her this wasn't a friendly visit. "We need to alert the Council," Sean said, his voice steady but tense. "They need to know." Lena hesitated, her mind racing. The Council would demand answers, and once the colony knew they had been found, panic would spread. And then, the secret might slip. She couldn't afford that. Not yet. "Give me a minute," she said, her voice tight. "I need to think." Sean looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. He didn't press her. He knew better than anyone the weight of what they were facing. "We don't have much time," he said before leaving the room. Lena turned back to the screen, staring at the image of the approaching vessel. Whoever they were, they had come for something. Maybe they had picked up the faint traces of the genetic anomaly she had been working on. Maybe they had already guessed the truth. Whatever the reason, she knew one thing for certain. The fragile peace they had lived in for so long was about to be shattered. Far beyond the isolated colony, where Lena grappled with the impossible truth, a different kind of struggle was unfolding. In the heart of the galaxy, at the center of a sprawling station that housed the rulers of countless worlds, the Galactic Council was meeting. Its chambers, carved from a cold stone unfamiliar to human hands, hummed with an energy that seemed to vibrate with centuries of unspoken tension. Here, decisions that shaped entire civilizations were made, yet the individuals within these walls often felt powerless against the currents they themselves set into motion. Today, the air was charged with something heavier uncertainty. The anomaly detected near the human colony had reached the Council's ears within hours. Even in the distant reaches of space, where the colony had sought refuge from the galaxy's watchful eyes, nothing truly escaped the Council's notice. Chancellor Kryler, a towering figure from the Rysar species, stood at the head of the Council's circular chamber. His species, known for their cold intellect and long lifespans, had dominated the Council for as long as anyone could remember. Kryler's face, sharp and unyielding, gave no hint of the calculations constantly running behind his crimson eyes. "This news is not unexpected," Kryler's voice reverberated through the chamber, silencing the low murmurs that had rippled across the gathered representatives. "Humanity was always an unpredictable element in our galaxy. This anomaly confirms what many of us feared. They are not as they seem. The council was comprised of representatives from dozens of species, each seated at a platform that jutted out toward the center, where Kryler presided. Among them, Sean of the Zorani, a smaller and less powerful race, leaned forward, his expression more thoughtful than alarmed. His people had always been regarded as the diplomats, the peacemakers of the galaxy, their survival dependent on their ability to weave through the tensions of more aggressive species. "I would caution against drawing conclusions too quickly, Chancellor," Sean interjected, his voice calm but firm. "The detection of an anomaly does not automatically imply a threat. We must consider the possibility that this is an isolated incident, one that does not require immediate intervention." A ripple of discontent passed through the chamber. It was no secret that many within the council viewed humanity with suspicion, if not outright fear. For centuries, they had been watched from afar, their rapid development both remarkable and unsettling. Unlike the other species in the galaxy, who had evolved slowly, methodically, over millennia, humans seemed to leap forward in unpredictable ways. And now, with the discovery of something like regeneration, something that could potentially alter the balance of power in the galaxy, the Council was forced to confront a difficult question: what to do with them. Kryler's gaze turned to Sean, his expression unreadable. "Isolated incidents have a way of spreading," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You speak of caution, but we have seen what humanity is capable of. They grow, they adapt, and now, they regenerate. How long before this anomaly becomes a weapon? How long before they become more than we can control?" Sean's brow furrowed, but he remained composed. "Control," he repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "Is that what this is about? Controlling them?" A silence fell over the chamber, thick with unspoken truths. The reality was simple. The Council had long sought to maintain the status quo, a delicate balance of power between the dominant species of the galaxy. Humanity, despite their smaller numbers and relatively short lifespans, represented a disruption to that balance. And now, with the possibility of regeneration, a trait no other species possessed, they were on the verge of becoming something more than the Council had anticipated. Kryler leaned forward, his voice sharp. "If we do not control them, they will control us. History has shown that. Every species, given the chance, will seek to expand, to dominate. Humanity is no different. We have allowed them to grow too far, too quickly." Sean didn't flinch under Kryler's gaze. He had seen the Chancellor use fear to manipulate the Council before, twisting facts to fit his narrative. But this was different. The stakes were higher, and Kryler wasn't wrong. Humanity had always been ambitious, driven by a hunger that other species couldn't quite understand. But was that enough to justify what Kryler was suggesting? "Eradication is not the answer," Sean said quietly, but his words carried weight. "To destroy an entire species out of fear, that would make us no better than the very threat we seek to avoid." Kryler's eyes narrowed. "We are not talking about eradication, Sean. We are talking about protection. For centuries, the Council has kept the peace by ensuring no single species gains too much power. We have seen what happens when that balance is disrupted. Entire worlds have been lost." "And yet you would lose another world," Sean shot back, his voice gaining strength. "Is that truly the legacy we want to leave behind? That whenever we feel threatened, we destroy rather than understand?" The chamber was silent again, the weight of Sean's words hanging in the air. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of where to stand on the issue. The history of the Council was stained with the quiet erasure of species deemed too dangerous to be allowed to survive. Most had been smaller, less advanced civilizations that had never posed a real threat. But humanity was different. Their potential was undeniable, and that potential scared the Council in ways they had never admitted. Kryler, sensing the hesitation in the room, pressed his advantage. "Understanding them will not change the reality of what they are becoming. They are no longer the fragile species we once knew. If we allow them to continue on this path, they will evolve into something we cannot predict, something that will threaten the very fabric of the galaxy." Sean remained silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. You speak of evolution, Chancellor, but isn't that what we all seek? To grow, to change? If humanity has found a way to transcend their limitations, should we not ask how, instead of fearing the consequences? Kryler's lips curled into a thin smile. And what would you have us do, Sean? Ask them politely to share their secrets. Offer them a seat at the council table. You know as well as I do that humanity is not so easily swayed. They do not bargain when they believe they hold an advantage. Perhaps not, Sean conceded. But if we move against them now, without understanding the full extent of this anomaly, we risk starting a conflict we cannot win. Several heads nodded in agreement, though the tension in the room remained palpable. The idea of conflict with humanity was not new, but it was a prospect that had always seemed distant, a future problem to be dealt with when necessary. Now, with the discovery of regeneration, that future had become alarmingly close. One of the council members, a short and heavily armored figure from the Draxian species, spoke up. His voice was rough, his words deliberate. What if this anomaly is limited to a single human? What if it is not a trait that can be spread? We should investigate further before making any decisions. Sean nodded in agreement. Exactly. We need more information before we decide on a course of action. Sending a diplomatic envoy to the colony may provide the answers we need. We can approach them under the guise of a routine inspection, without revealing the true extent of our concerns. Kryler's eyes flashed with something unreadable. And if we find that this regeneration is not limited, if we discover that all humans possess this potential, Sean didn't hesitate. Then we reassess, but we do not act out of fear. The chamber fell silent again, the weight of the decision looming over the council like a dark cloud. Kryler's gaze swept the room, searching for signs of weakness, of doubt. But for the first time in a long while, he found resistance. The council was not as easily swayed as he had hoped. We will put it to a vote, Kryler said at last, his voice cold. Those in favor of sending a diplomatic envoy to investigate the anomaly, raise your hands. Slowly, one by one, hands began to rise. Sean's heart lifted as he saw that the majority were in favor of his proposal. Kryler, however, remained impassive, his face betraying none of the frustration he must have felt. He simply nodded. Very well, the Chancellor said, his voice tight. We will send an envoy. But make no mistake, if we find that humanity poses a threat, we will take whatever action is necessary to preserve the balance of this galaxy. The meeting adjourned, and the council members began to file out of the chamber, their faces lined with the gravity of what had just been decided. Sean remained in his seat for a moment longer, staring at the empty podium where Kryler had stood. He knew that this was only the beginning. The discovery of the anomaly would send shockwaves through the galaxy, and humanity, whether they knew it or not, was now at the center of a much larger game. As he rose to leave, Sean couldn't shake the feeling that the council had already made up its mind, even before the investigation had begun. And yet, there was still a part of him that believed there was another way, one that didn't end in destruction. He only hoped that when the time came, the council would be willing to listen. The galaxy, in all its vastness, had always been a place of conflict, of power struggles that shaped the destinies of countless worlds. But now, with the rise of humanity, the question was no longer about maintaining the balance. It was about what happened when that balance was broken. And in that question, the future of the galaxy hung, uncertain and fragile. Lena stood at the colony's outpost, the expanse of the barren landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dry earth, painting the colony in shades of fading gold. Her fingers drummed absently against the railing, her mind far from the world around her. The faint hum of machinery and distant murmur of workers provided a familiar backdrop, but it did nothing to ease the tension knotting in her chest. She hadn't spoken of the incident, her body's inexplicable regeneration, to anyone, not even to those she trusted most. In the days that had followed, she'd waited, expecting some sort of explanation or revelation, but nothing had come. Life had continued. The colony had gone about its daily routines, unaware that something was stirring within her, something she couldn't yet explain. But today, that quiet was broken. An alert had gone out, the colony's scanners picking up an unknown craft entering their atmosphere. Alien visitors were rare here at the far edge of the galaxy, but not unheard of. Yet this arrival felt different. It wasn't just a diplomatic envoy. There was a weight to it that Lena couldn't shake. She turned as the colony's governor, a stern man with weathered features named Merrick, approached. His steps were brisk, purposeful, the way they always were when he had orders to give. "They're almost here," he said without preamble, his voice clipped. "An envoy from the Galactic Council. They've requested to speak with our leadership." Lena raised an eyebrow. "The Council? Why would they send someone all the way out here?" Merrick's expression tightened. "We're not sure yet, but it's not a coincidence. The timing's too convenient." Lena nodded, though a chill ran down her spine. She hadn't considered that her incident might be connected to something larger. It seemed impossible, but then again, nothing had felt normal since that day. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as a small ship descended from the sky, its sleek, silver form gleaming in the fading light. The landing was smooth, practiced, the ship settling onto the ground with a quiet hiss. A ramp extended, and from the shadows within, figures began to emerge. Lena's breath caught as she saw them. Aliens, though not unfamiliar. She recognized the leader immediately from his distinctive features. Sean, the Zerani diplomat, a species known for their deep blue skin and delicate, almost ethereal appearance. His movements were fluid, graceful, and his eyes sharp. Intelligence scanned the surroundings with a quiet intensity. Behind him, two more Zerani followed, though they remained at a respectful distance. It was clear that Sean was the one in charge, the one who would be speaking on behalf of the Council. Merrick stepped forward to greet him, and Lena forced herself to follow, though her mind raced with questions. What did the Council want with them? What was Sean's purpose here? Sean stopped a few feet from Merrick, his expression neutral, but his posture relaxed. "Governor Merrick," he greeted, his voice smooth, measured. "I appreciate your willingness to meet with us on short notice." Merrick nodded curtly. "We're always open to diplomatic relations, but I assume this isn't just a social visit." Sean's lips curved into a polite smile. "No, it is not." His gaze flickered to Lena for the briefest of moments, then back to Merrick. "We've been made aware of certain anomalies in this region. The Council has sent us to investigate." Lena's heart skipped a beat. Anomalies. Did he know? Had the Council somehow learned about what had happened to her? She kept her expression carefully neutral, but her thoughts were racing. If Sean was here because of her, what did that mean for the colony? For her? Merrick, ever the diplomat, didn't let his surprise show. "We've had no reports of anomalies," he said, his tone guarded. "But we're happy to cooperate with the Council's investigation. I trust this will be a transparent process." Sean inclined his head slightly. "Of course. We are merely here to observe, to understand. Nothing more." His words were diplomatic, but Lena sensed something beneath them, a tension that wasn't quite visible, but was undeniably present. She glanced at Sean again, trying to read him, but his expression remained impassive. The meeting was brief, Sean outlining the basic parameters of the Council's investigation, Merrick agreeing to provide whatever assistance was necessary. But as they spoke, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was at play, something that neither Sean nor the Council had fully revealed. Once the formalities were over, Merrick gestured for Lena to lead the way toward the colony's main building, where Sean and his team would be staying during their investigation. As they walked, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Sean's eyes, though focused on the path ahead, occasionally darted toward Lena, as if he were trying to discern something about her. She could feel his gaze, could sense the curiosity that lingered just beneath the surface. It made her uneasy, but it also intrigued her. What was he looking for? Finally, as they approached the building, Sean broke the silence. "You're Lena, correct? the one who oversees the colony's research division. Lena glanced at him, surprised that he knew who she was. Yes, I handle most of the scientific operations here. Sean nodded thoughtfully. You must have a unique perspective, then, being so close to the ground, so to speak. Lena wasn't sure how to respond to that. I suppose, she said cautiously, we don't get many visitors from the council out here. It's not exactly a hub of activity. Sean's lips quirked slightly. No, I imagine it's not. But sometimes, the most isolated places hold the most important secrets. There was something in his tone, something subtle but unmistakable, that made Lena's pulse quicken. Did he know? Had he somehow discovered what had happened to her? She couldn't be sure, but the possibility hung between them, a shadow neither could fully see but both could feel. They reached the entrance to the building, and Lena gestured for Sean to follow her inside. The interior was modest, functional, with no frills or unnecessary decorations. It was a working colony, after all, not a political capital. As they walked down the corridor toward the guest quarters, Sean's voice broke the silence again. You seem tense, he observed quietly. Is something troubling you? Lena hesitated. She wanted to deny it, to brush off his question, but something in his tone made her pause. It wasn't accusatory or probing, it was genuine, almost concerned. She glanced at him, unsure of how much to reveal. I suppose it's just the surprise of your visit, she said carefully. We weren't expecting anyone from the council, especially not so suddenly. Sean nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand. The council's actions can be unpredictable at times. But I assure you, we mean no harm. We're simply here to observe, to learn. Lena wasn't sure she believed that. The council had a long history of observation that often led to less than pleasant outcomes for those being observed. But she didn't say that. Instead, she simply nodded and continued walking. When they reached the guest quarters, Lena opened the door and gestured for Sean to enter. These will be your accommodations during your stay. If you need anything, you can contact me or the governor. Sean stepped inside, glancing around the room with a faint smile. Thank you, Lena. I appreciate your hospitality. There was a pause, a moment of hesitation between them, before Lena finally turned to leave. But just as she reached the door, Sean's voice stopped her. Lena. She turned, meeting his gaze. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something that hinted at a deeper understanding than he had let on. If there's anything you wish to share with me, he said quietly, I'm here to listen. Lena's heart raced. He knew, maybe not everything, but enough to suspect that something was off. She could feel the weight of his words, the unspoken offer of trust, of understanding. But she wasn't ready, not yet. With a nod, she stepped out of the room, closing the door behind her. As she walked down the corridor, her mind swirled with questions, doubts, and the growing realization that the secrets she was keeping wouldn't stay hidden for long. In the quiet of his quarters, Sean stood by the window, watching as the last of the sunlight faded beyond the horizon. His thoughts were troubled, his mind wrestling with the complexities of his mission. The council had sent him here to investigate, to uncover the truth about the anomalies in this region. But as he observed Lena and the colony, he found himself questioning the council's motives. There was something about humanity, something resilient, something powerful that intrigued him. And Lena, she was at the center of it all. For the first time in a long while, Sean felt uncertain. His loyalty to the council had always been steadfast, but now, as he stood on the precipice of discovery, he found himself wondering if the council's agenda was truly just. Lena sat at her workbench, her fingers tracing the edge of the datapad, but her eyes were fixed on nothing in particular. The soft hum of the colony's equipment usually brought her a sense of focus, but today it was an irritating reminder of the steady beat of time. Time that she felt slipping away with every indecisive breath she took. The regeneration had begun subtly enough, flesh stitching itself together where wounds should have scarred, but it had become undeniable after that day. The cracked ribs that should have taken months to heal had vanished in hours. leaving behind no trace of injury. No one knew but her, and she wasn't sure whether that was a blessing or a curse. The silence of her lab, normally comforting, felt suffocating now. It was here, in this very space, where she once felt control, a sense of purpose in unraveling the mysteries of the universe. But that control had been fractured, disturbed by something that defied every rule of biology she had known. The door to the lab slid open with a soft hiss. Lena didn't turn to look, but she knew who it was. Merrick's heavy steps had always been distinct, deliberate. He moved with the kind of authority that reminded her of old soldiers, those who had seen enough to have nothing left to fear. "Lena," his voice broke the quiet with a gravitas that felt out of place in this familiar room. "We need to talk." She sighed inwardly, her thumb skimming the edge of the datapad in small, anxious movements. About the Zerani? Or something else? His presence hovered just behind her, a silent pressure on her shoulders. "This isn't about diplomacy." Merrick's tone hardened. "It's about what you've been keeping from us." Lena's fingers stopped. The datapad fell silent in her lap as she turned slowly, meeting Merrick's steady gaze. There was no accusation there, not yet. But his eyes were sharp, as if he was already piecing things together, waiting for her to confirm what he suspected. "I don't know what you mean," Lena said carefully, her voice lacking the conviction she needed. Merrick crossed his arms, his stance wide as if bracing for impact. "The Council has their suspicions, and you've been distant. I'm not a fool. Something happened to you, didn't it? And if I'm right, it's something that can't be ignored." Lena opened her mouth, but no words came out. She could feel her chest tightening, the weight of her secret pulling down on her ribs, constricting her lungs. She had kept it from them because she had no answers. She still didn't. She stood abruptly, pushing her chair back and walking toward the large window at the far side of the room. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the colony outside, a world that had become her entire existence. A world she might have to betray with the truth. "If I tell you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what happens next." Behind her, Merrick stayed silent, waiting. Lena placed her palm on the cool glass, watching the distant shapes of workers moving about, unaware of the storm that was brewing. "Something's changed in me," she admitted quietly. "Physically. But it's more than that. It's regeneration, like the body knows how to heal itself in ways I've never seen before." Merrick didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was low, measured. "You're saying you've experienced it personally?" Lena nodded, still not turning around. "I should have been injured badly, but the wounds, they vanished, like they were never there." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, before Merrick finally spoke again. "And you think this is happening to others as well?" "I don't know," Lena admitted. "But if it is, this changes everything. And not just for us. For the entire human race." Merrick's presence moved closer, but he remained a careful distance away. "The Council would see this as a threat," he said quietly, his voice almost drowned by the hum of the machines. "But others, there are those who would see this as an opportunity." Lena closed her eyes. She knew exactly what he meant. The factions had always existed, ever since humanity had first expanded into the stars. At the heart of their disagreements was the same question: what was the future of humanity? And now, with the possibility of regeneration, that question had become far more dangerous. She could already imagine the reactions. The militaristic faction, always pushing for dominance, would seize on this ability as a weapon. If humans could regenerate, they would become invincible on the battlefield. Entire wars could be won without the cost of human life. They would see it as a means to ensure humanity's survival in an unforgiving galaxy. But the pacifists would see it differently. They had always warned of the dangers of tampering with life and death, arguing that humanity's strength lay not in its power, but in its mortality. To them, regeneration wasn't a gift, it was a curse, something that would strip away what it meant to be human. It would lead to overpopulation, endless conflict, and, eventually, extinction. "Are you going to tell the Colony Council?" Merrick's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. He was watching her carefully, his arms now uncrossed, hands at his sides. Or do you intend to keep this to yourself? Lena shook her head. I don't know what to do, Merrick. If I tell them, it could tear us apart. People will choose sides, and there's no going back once this is out. And if you don't tell them, his question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and unavoidable. Lena turned away from the window, her arms crossing over her chest as if she could shield herself from the weight of her own thoughts. I keep hoping that maybe it's just me. Maybe this is an isolated case, and I won't have to make that decision. But what if it's not? What if others are already experiencing this, and we don't even know it? Merrick stepped closer, his voice softening in a way that felt almost unnatural for him. You've always been cautious, Lena. Always thinking ahead. But we don't have the luxury of waiting anymore. The council is here, and they're going to start asking questions. We need to be prepared. Lena met his gaze, searching for something guidance, reassurance, anything that would make this easier. But Merrick's face, as always, offered only reality. He was right. The time for hesitation was gone. I'm not ready for this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to be the one who has to decide what happens next. Merrick gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. None of us are ever ready. But we don't get to choose when we face these things. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lena allowed herself to lean on someone else, if only for a moment. The weight of her decision was still there, still suffocating, but now it was shared, if only a little. There's one thing you have to remember, Merrick said quietly. Whatever happens next, whatever you choose to do, it will change everything. For you, for the colony, for all of us. Lena swallowed hard, nodding. She knew that, deep down. She had known it from the moment she realized what was happening to her. But hearing it spoken aloud, from someone else, made it feel more real, more immediate. As Merrick turned to leave, Lena's mind raced, the looming decision pressing harder against her thoughts. Could she trust the colony with this knowledge? Would revealing the truth about regeneration bring them closer together or tear them apart, as factions fought over the implications of immortality? The truth felt like a fragile thing, delicate in her hands, easily shattered. Once she released it, there would be no turning back. The night sky above the colony was a deep indigo, peppered with faint stars that barely pierced the atmosphere's light haze. Lena sat in her lab, still as the realization of the previous day weighed heavily on her. Her thoughts were like errant fragments, splintered and ungrounded, drifting between the revelations about her regeneration and the decision she had yet to make. Merrick's words echoed in her mind, but there was a growing discomfort that had nothing to do with her internal conflict. She glanced toward the large window, her fingers absently tapping the edge of her workbench. There was something about the night that felt different. For the past few days, a nagging sense had been creeping in, settling into the pit of her stomach. She hadn't spoken of it, but she could feel it, a presence, as though eyes unseen were lingering just out of sight, watching. Her gaze swept across the darkened horizon beyond the glass. Everything appeared normal, calm, even. The low hum of the colony systems and the faint murmur of distant conversations outside her lab created a serene backdrop. But that serenity was deceptive. Lena had been at the colony long enough to trust her instincts, and they were telling her something wasn't right. She closed the datapad on her desk, pushing it away as she stood. The unease had become too persistent to ignore any longer. Leaving the lab, she stepped out into the cool air, her breath forming faint puffs in the night. She walked slowly, almost cautiously, her eyes darting to the shadows between the buildings. The colony, despite its minimalistic architecture, usually felt open and safe, but tonight it felt constricting, like the walls were closing in. Lena wasn't sure what she was looking for, only that she would know it when she found it, or when it found her. At the same time, high above the planet's surface, a small ship hovered in geosynchronous orbit, invisible to the human colony below. Its dark, sleek design blended seamlessly into the night sky, cloaked in technology that even Lena's advanced sensors would struggle to detect. Inside, the crew of the elite alien task force moved with quiet precision. Sean, standing at the viewport of the ship, looked down at the colony. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of the console, was set in a grim expression. He had known this moment would come, knew that the Galactic Council would send someone, but not like this. He had hoped for diplomacy, but instead they had sent infiltrators. His orders were clear: observe, report, and if necessary, neutralize. But Sean's loyalties had become tangled, complicated in ways he hadn't anticipated. When he first arrived on this human outpost, it had been as part of a routine mission. He had expected the humans to be, as the Council described, primitive, self-destructive, unworthy of galactic consideration. But what he found was far more complex. They were resilient, driven. And then there was Lena. She was unlike anyone he had encountered before, though he never allowed himself to think too deeply about why. He had spent months blending in, keeping his identity hidden, but the connection he had formed with her was undeniable. It was that connection that troubled him now. Sean, a voice cut through his thoughts. The commander of the task force, a tall, imposing figure with jet black eyes, stepped into the room. "We are ready to begin the operation. The Council demands results. This colony must be evaluated as a potential threat to the greater peace." Sean turned slowly, his hands clasped behind his back to mask his unease. "What are your plans?" he asked, his tone controlled, careful. The commander tilted his head slightly, sensing the hesitation in Sean's voice. "Simple observation. For now, we'll monitor their movements, their communications. Any sign of resistance or aggression will be met with swift action." He stepped closer to Sean, his eyes narrowing. "I expect no interference from you. The Council trusts you've integrated well with these humans. Your insights will be valuable, but your loyalty lies with the Council." Sean gave a small nod, though inwardly his mind was racing. This was no ordinary mission. The commander had made that clear. But Sean's connection with the humans, particularly Lena, made him question the Council's motives. He had seen enough to know that humanity wasn't the threat the Council believed them to be. But would they listen if he tried to explain? Could he even betray his mission for them? The commander gave Sean one last look before turning away. "We begin tonight. Make sure you're ready." As the door slid shut behind the commander, Sean exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the impending operation settle on his chest. He knew what was coming, and he knew Lena was at the heart of it. Back on the ground, Lena continued her slow patrol through the colony, her nerves on edge. She passed by the colony's perimeter, her gaze scanning the fences and the surrounding darkness beyond them. Everything appeared as it should, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, hidden just beyond her reach. She stopped by one of the security stations, leaning against the metal rail as she checked the perimeter sensors. The readings were normal, as they had been for days, but Lena wasn't satisfied. There were gaps, blind spots in the system she had noticed in recent weeks. They were subtle, easily overlooked by most, but Lena's mind didn't work that way. She saw the patterns, the inconsistencies, and she knew how to follow them. "Something bothering you?" A familiar voice startled her from her thoughts. Lena turned quickly to see Sean standing a few feet away, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He had a way of moving silently, a skill she had grown accustomed to, though it never stopped catching her off guard. "Just thinking," she replied, trying to mask the suspicion in her voice. "The sensors are showing nothing, but I can't shake this feeling. It's like we're being watched." Sean raised an eyebrow, stepping closer, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You always were paranoid," he said lightly, though his tone lacked its usual warmth. He glanced at the monitors, his eyes scanning them quickly. "But then again, you're usually right when you have a hunch." Lena gave him a sideways glance, unsure whether to take comfort in his words. There was something different about Sean tonight. His usual calm demeanor was intact, but there was an undercurrent she couldn't quite place, a tension that seemed just beneath the surface. "I don't know," she admitted, turning back to the monitors. Maybe it's nothing, but I've been seeing irregularities in the sensors for a while now. Little things, gaps in the readings that don't make sense. Sean remained quiet for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. What kind of gaps? Lena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She trusted Sean more than most, but trust was becoming a fragile thing. Areas where the sensors just drop off, like something's interfering with them. It's subtle, but consistent. Sean's expression darkened, though he hid it quickly. Have you reported this to anyone? Not yet, Lena said, her voice softer now. I wanted to make sure it wasn't just a malfunction, but now I'm not so sure. Sean's eyes lingered on her, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something concerned. Perhaps it was gone before she could be certain. He glanced toward the dark perimeter beyond the colony's walls, his hands slipping from his pockets as he took a step forward. I'll look into it, he said quietly. In the meantime, keep this between us. No need to raise alarms until we know for sure. Lena frowned, but nodded. There was something in Sean's voice that made her uneasy, though she couldn't place why. She trusted him, didn't she? He had never given her reason to doubt him before, but the weight of the past few days was beginning to erode that trust in ways she hadn't anticipated. As the night stretched on, Sean returned to the alien task force's base. Inside, the team was already at work, monitoring the colony's systems and movements. The commander was seated at the central console, watching the live feeds with a satisfied smirk. We've found their weakness, the commander said as Sean approached. There are gaps in their perimeter sensors. We'll use those to our advantage. Sean felt a knot tighten in his chest. Those gaps had been noted by Lena, too. She was on the verge of discovering the task force's presence, and it was only a matter of time before things escalated. Do what you need to, Sean said carefully, his voice neutral. Just remember, we're here to observe. We can't afford to be discovered. The commander's eyes flicked to Sean, narrowing slightly. Don't worry, we'll handle it. Lena stood in the center of her lab, staring at the blank wall as though it could provide her the answers she so desperately needed. The soft hum of the equipment, once a calming presence, now felt oppressive, a constant reminder of the decision she had made, the choice that now rippled through the colony like a slow, creeping storm. Her son's face flickered in her mind, a mixture of innocence and something darker. She had never expected him to become a symbol. But there he was, at the heart of a crisis that was growing beyond her control. Outside the lab, voices rose, a mix of excitement, anger, and confusion. Word had spread quickly. Someone she didn't know who had leaked the details of her research of the regeneration, and not just hers. It was her son, Evan, who had been thrust into the center of the debate. Lena had kept the specifics of his condition hidden for years, hoping to spare him the scrutiny she had always feared. But now the secret was out. Evan had become a symbol of something greater, something people could neither fully comprehend nor accept. As she paced the room, she could hear the distant echoes of chaos unfolding in the streets. People were divided. Some believed regeneration was the future, a gift that could unlock new potential for humanity, a way to overcome death itself. Others saw it as an affront to nature, a curse that would unravel the very fabric of life. For some, Evan was a miracle. For others, he was an abomination. Lena turned back to her desk, staring down at the data readouts and reports that suddenly seemed meaningless. What had started as a project to heal, to protect, had spiraled into something far beyond her control. She wasn't sure when it had slipped from her hands, but it was clear now that there was no turning back. The colony was fracturing, and Lena felt herself caught in the middle, responsible, yet powerless. She had thought of regeneration as a path to something better. She had seen the suffering around her, the lives lost too soon, the future stolen by war and disease. But now, standing on the edge of this moment, she wasn't sure if she had made the right choice. The burden of it weighed heavily on her chest, like an anchor pulling her down into a place she wasn't sure she could escape from. The colony square was a stark contrast to the quiet tension in Lena's lab. Crowds gathered, filling the space with a sea of bodies, all talking at once. The air was thick with emotion, anger, fear, hope. In the center of it all stood a hastily erected podium, where leaders of various factions took turns addressing the growing crowd. It had become a battleground of ideas, with each side fighting to claim the narrative. One man, his voice raised in a plea for caution, spoke with conviction. "We cannot pretend that this doesn't change everything. If we embrace this power, what does that mean for us as a people? Are we ready to live forever, to watch our children never age, never die? Death gives life meaning." A murmur spread through the crowd, some nodding in agreement while others shouted in opposition. "We're not meant to live forever," the man continued, his voice cracking with the weight of his words. "We've seen what happens when we try to control life and death. It leads to destruction, to hubris. How long before we lose what makes us human?" Across the square, another voice rose, filled with passion and defiance. "You speak of fear, but this is an opportunity. We've been struggling for centuries fighting against disease, watching our loved ones waste away. Regeneration is the next step. It's a gift, not a curse. Lena's work has given us a future." The crowd erupted in heated debate. The fracture was visible, palpable. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was a clash of fundamentally different worldviews, and there was no clear path to reconciliation. Back in the lab, Lena was still staring at the monitor when the door slid open. Merrick entered, his face drawn with tension. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her. Lena could feel his presence behind her, a silent question hanging in the air between them. "It's out of control," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Merrick nodded slowly. "I heard the speeches. People are losing their minds." "Do you think they're right?" she asked, turning to face him. "Am I wrong? Was I wrong to do this?" Merrick didn't answer right away. He crossed the room, leaning against the edge of her desk, his arms crossed over his chest. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "It's not a question with a simple answer. People are scared. Some are excited. But this is bigger than any of us expected." Lena sighed, rubbing her temples. "It was never supposed to be like this. I just wanted to save lives. I didn't think—" "That's the problem, isn't it?" Merrick interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "You didn't think. Not all the way through. None of us did." There was a bitterness in his tone that Lena had never heard before. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the toll this was taking on him, too. Merrick had been with her from the beginning, one of the few people who understood the weight of what they were doing. But now, even he seemed uncertain. "What are you afraid of?" Lena asked, her voice quiet. Merrick's jaw tightened. "What am I afraid of? I'm afraid we've opened a door that can't be closed. I'm afraid we've set something in motion that we can't control. Regeneration isn't just about healing anymore. It's about power. People are going to fight over it. They're going to kill for it. And Evan, he's at the center of it all." Lena flinched at the mention of her son. "I never wanted this for him." "I know," Merrick said, his voice softening. "But that doesn't change the fact that he's become a symbol. People are projecting all their hopes and fears onto him. He's not just a boy anymore. He's something else." Lena sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know how to fix this." Merrick was silent for a moment. Then he crouched down in front of her, his eyes searching hers. "Maybe we can't fix it. Maybe it's too late for that. But we can still try to guide it. If we don't, someone else will. And I don't trust anyone else to make the right decisions." Lena looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "And what's the right decision, Merrick? How do we decide who gets to live forever and who doesn't?" Merrick stood up, running a hand through his hair. "That's the real question, isn't it? What does it mean to be human if we take away death? If we live forever, do we lose something essential? Or is it the ultimate freedom?" Lena didn't answer. She didn't know how to. The questions he posed echoed the ones that had been circling in her mind since the beginning. At first, it had seemed so simple regeneration would save lives, prevent needless suffering. But now, as she stood on the edge of this new world, she wasn't sure anymore. Was death necessary for life to have meaning? Or was it just a limitation that humanity could finally overcome? Evan sat alone in his room, the noise of the colony distant but ever present. He had heard the rumors, seen the way people looked at him when he walked through the streets. Some with awe, others with fear. He had never asked for this, never wanted to be different. But now he couldn't escape it. His thoughts were jumbled, torn between what his mother had told him and what he saw in the eyes of the people around him. He was scared, though he would never admit it. Scared of what he had become, scared of what he represented. There was a knock at the door, and before he could respond, it opened. Lena stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. "Hey," she said softly. Evan didn't look up. "They're calling me a god," he said, his voice hollow. "Some of them, anyway." Lena closed the door behind her, crossing the room to sit beside him. "You're not a god, Evan. You're my son." "Am I, though?" Evan asked, finally meeting her gaze. "I'm not like anyone else. I can't die. What does that make me?" Lena felt her throat tighten. She had never wanted him to feel this way, to feel isolated, different. "You're still you," she said quietly. "That hasn't changed." "But it has," Evan insisted. "I'm not like them anymore. They're afraid of me." Lena reached out, taking his hand. "People fear what they don't understand. But you're still human, Evan. No matter what happens, you're still you." Evan looked away, his expression unreadable. "I don't feel human." The debate raged on in the square, with no sign of slowing. More voices had joined the fray, some calling for the end of regeneration research, others demanding it be shared with the entire colony. The fractures were deepening, and there was no easy resolution in sight. Back in the lab, Lena stood alone, staring at the data screens, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She had wanted to change the world, and now she had. But at what cost? The burden of immortality was heavier than she had ever imagined. The air had a biting chill, heavier now with a tension that stretched through every corridor and every silent glance exchanged between those who prepared for the inevitable. The sky above the colony hung low, a dull bruise of clouds that seemed to suffocate the last vestiges of peace. Lena stood at the edge of the control deck, watching the horizon. It had begun. There was no formal declaration. The alien force moved like a storm, quiet and cold, pressing upon the colony from all sides. Lena's breath caught as the lights of their ships flickered on the far horizon. The ground beneath the colony trembled ever so slightly, a precursor to the chaos that was about to unfold. This was no longer a debate in a square. The conversation had shifted from words to violence. War, as silent as it was inevitable, had come. Merrick watched from a different vantage point. He stood with the soldiers, his face grim and taut. Each man and woman around him held their weapons tightly, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. He could feel the tremors in the earth beneath his feet, the vibrations of an approaching force that would not relent until the colony was left in ruins or saved by some miracle they couldn't predict. He thought of the conversations they had shared in the quiet moments of preparation, the hushed admissions of doubt, the musings on what it meant to face something so vast, so alien. The regeneration had changed things for them. Their bodies were stronger, faster, able to endure blows that would have killed them months ago. But there was no denying the other change, the one that no one wanted to speak of. Regeneration was not the clean miracle they had once believed. Soldiers who had gone through it, who had come back from the edge of death, returned different. They spoke less. Their eyes carried a faraway look, haunted by something none of them could explain. The physical wounds healed, but something deeper did not. There were whispers that the mind was not meant to endure such trauma repeatedly. Some men had begun to speak of strange visions, of an unshakable feeling that their sense of self was slipping away, piece by piece. Merrick had seen it for himself. One soldier, barely 19, had begged him to let him die after his second regeneration. The boy had clawed at his own face, crying out about visions of shadows that pursued him, taunting him. Merrick had held him down, trying to calm him, but the boy's screams echoed in his ears long after it was over. The price of immortality, it seemed, was far steeper than they had imagined. The first attack came without warning. The alien ships descended from the sky like predators, diving upon their prey, swift and silent. The colony's defenses flared to life. A barrage of energy burst, lighting up the darkened sky. The ground shook with the impact of the first wave, sending shockwaves through the buildings and streets. Merrick was in the thick of it, leading a squad of soldiers as they raced to intercept the advancing alien forces. The aliens moved with an eerie precision, their weapons crackling with energy, tearing through the air with deadly efficiency. The humans fought back with everything they had, but for every alien they cut down, 2 more seemed to take its place. It wasn't long before the first human soldiers began to fall. Merrick watched as one of his men took a direct hit to the chest, the energy blast sending him sprawling to the ground. The others hesitated for a moment, waiting to see if he would rise. And then, with a sickening crack, the man's body began to mend. The twisted flesh knit itself back together, bones realigned, and within moments, the soldier was back on his feet, gasping for air. But his eyes were different. Merrick saw it instantly. There was a dullness there, a kind of emptiness that hadn't been present before. The man looked around, disoriented, as though he didn't quite recognize where he was. His hands trembled as he picked up his weapon, but he pressed on, following orders with a mechanical obedience. Merrick's heart sank. This was the reality of regeneration. Yes, the body could heal, but the mind was breaking. The battle raged on, each wave of alien soldiers crashing against the human defenders like relentless tides. For every inch they gained, they lost 3 more, and all the while, the humans who regenerated began to change. Merrick could see it happening, even as he fought for his own life. A woman to his left took a blow to the head, her skull caving in before slowly reforming. She stood, blinking rapidly, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Another man lost his leg, only for it to grow back, though his movements were slower, more uncertain than before. It was the mind that couldn't keep up. Each death, each resurrection, stripped away something vital. The human spirit, resilient as it was, had limits, and now they were seeing those limits laid bare. In the heart of the colony, Lena could hear the distant sounds of battle. She hadn't left the lab. She couldn't. Evan was there, lying on a table, surrounded by the machines that kept him stable. He hadn't woken since his last regeneration. His body had healed, but his mind, she wasn't sure if he was still in there. She glanced at the monitors, watching the neural activity spike and dip. His brain was fighting something, struggling to hold on to itself. She had seen the same patterns in the others who had gone through the process multiple times. Each time, the brain tried to heal, but it became less coherent, less whole. Lena's hands trembled as she adjusted the equipment. She had done this. She had opened this door, thinking she was giving humanity a gift. But now, looking at her son, she wasn't sure if it was a gift or a curse. Evan's eyelids fluttered. He groaned softly, his fingers twitching. "Evan?" Lena whispered, leaning closer. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused, staring up at the ceiling. He didn't seem to see her. "Evan, can you hear me?" Lena's voice cracked with desperation. His mouth moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, finally, a single word escaped his lips, so faint she almost didn't hear it. "Why?" Lena's heart clenched. She didn't have an answer. She didn't know why. Back on the battlefield, Merrick could feel the tide turning, and not in their favor. The aliens were relentless, their strategies evolving with each wave. But it wasn't the aliens that worried him most, it was his own men. He watched as more and more of them regenerated, each time coming back a little less themselves. Some had started talking to people who weren't there, seeing things that didn't exist. Others had grown silent, their faces blank, moving through the motions of combat without any emotion, as though they were already dead inside. Merrick himself had taken a hit, his arm shattered by a blast. The pain had been intense, but fleeting. Within minutes, the arm had healed, the bones knitting back together, the skin smooth and unscarred. But he could feel it, something wasn't right. There was a numbness in his hand, a disconnect between mind and body that unsettled him. He flexed his fingers, but they didn't respond as they should. He glanced at the soldier next to him, a woman who had regenerated 3 times already. She was staring blankly at the alien forces ahead, her face expressionless. Her weapon hung loosely in her hands, as if she had forgotten what she was supposed to do with it. "Focus," Merrick barked, trying to snap her out of it. She blinked, slowly, and for a moment, her eyes seemed to clear. But then she looked past him, her lips moving in a silent conversation with someone who wasn't there. Merrick's stomach churned. This wasn't sustainable. They couldn't keep fighting like this, regenerating, coming back, losing pieces of themselves each time. The mind was too fragile, too human to endure such strain. And then, as if to punctuate the thought, one of his men, someone he had known for years, collapsed to the ground, clutching his head and screaming. The others stepped back, watching in horror as the man convulsed, his eyes wild with terror. "No more," the man cried out, his voice hoarse and broken. "No more, please, just let me die." Merrick felt a cold knot in his stomach. He had heard that plea before. The man's body began to regenerate again, but his mind was gone. Whatever was left of him was now lost in the void, trapped in a cycle of endless life without relief. The battle stretched into hours, though it felt like days. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the battlefield, but the fighting didn't stop. The aliens pressed on, tireless, methodical, and the humans, those who remained, fought with a growing sense of desperation. Merrick could feel it, something had shifted. The cost of regeneration was no longer just a physical toll. It was existential. What did it mean to live without end, to watch your mind unravel while your body continued to heal? The lines between life and death, between self and other, were blurring. As the night deepened, Merrick found himself staring out over the battlefield, watching the distant lights of the alien ships flicker like cold stars. The humans who had regenerated too many times were still fighting, but they were no longer themselves. They had become something else, something hollow. And in that moment, Merrick realized the truth. Immortality wasn't the gift they had believed it to be. It was a prison. He turned away from the battle, his heart heavy with the weight of it all. The battlefield had quieted, though the silence was deceptive. The sky, streaked with the remnants of the day's carnage, felt like a looming threat rather than a respite. Merrick stood still for a moment, catching his breath amidst the wreckage, scanning the distant horizon for signs of the next wave. The endless cycle of regeneration had taken its toll on his squad. Men and women who were once filled with conviction now wandered the battlefield with vacant stares, their bodies whole but their minds fractured. He knew, even as they gathered themselves to fight again, that many of them were irreparably changed. Lena hadn't left Evan's side. The machines surrounding him beeped rhythmically, a strange comfort in the chaos that had engulfed the colony. She had hoped for something, anything that would show her he was coming back to her. His body had healed from the injuries that should have ended his life, but each breath he took felt like it belonged to someone else. He was alive in form, but the boy she had raised, the son she had fought so hard for, seemed lost in the process. The sound of distant explosions snapped her back to reality. She glanced at the door, knowing it was only a matter of time before the fighting spilled into the colony's heart once again, and this time there wouldn't be anywhere left to run. She rose from her seat, her legs stiff and aching from hours spent in the same position, and adjusted the blanket draped over Evan's chest. His eyes fluttered open for the briefest of moments, but there was no recognition there. It was a fleeting glimpse of life, quickly snuffed out by the blankness that had overtaken him. Lena swallowed hard, pushing down the despair threatening to overwhelm her. She had to focus. There was still a battle raging outside, and the colony needed every able-bodied person to defend it. She was no soldier, but in times like these, everyone had to fight, whether they were ready for it or not. Sean appeared in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. His clothes were stained with dirt and blood, a grim reminder of the struggle outside. He glanced at Evan, his expression unreadable, then shifted his gaze to Lena. "You need to come," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "It's getting worse." Lena didn't need to ask what he meant. She had heard the rumors, seen the signs. The regeneration had saved lives, yes, but it had also cost them something far more precious. Sean had seen it too. He had lost men, good men who had come back from the brink of death, only to lose themselves in the process. "How bad is it?" she asked, stepping toward him. Sean hesitated, glancing back toward the corridor, as if the truth was too much to confront head-on. "They're starting to turn on each other. Some of them—" He paused, the weight of the words pressing on his shoulders. "Some of them aren't right anymore. They're paranoid, hallucinating, and a few, they've stopped caring about the fight. They just wander off, lost." Lena nodded. It was worse than she had imagined. The regeneration wasn't just breaking their bodies, it was fracturing their souls. "We can't keep fighting like this, Lena." Sean's voice cracked with frustration, the fatigue seeping into his words. "We need to find a way out. If we don't, this colony won't survive, no matter how many times we bring people back." Lena looked back at Evan, her heart aching with a mixture of anger and guilt. She had once believed that regeneration was humanity's salvation. Now, she wasn't so sure. Could they really keep using something that tore them apart from the inside, even if it saved their lives? "I'll help," she said, her voice steady though she felt anything but. "But we need to stick together." Sean gave her a brief nod. There was no time for further words. As they moved into the corridor, the sounds of distant fighting grew louder. Sean led the way, his rifle slung across his back, and Lena followed, trying to block out the nagging fear that each step would bring them closer to a fate they couldn't escape. The colony had become a labyrinth of hastily constructed defenses and makeshift barricades. The few soldiers who hadn't yet succumbed to the mental strain of regeneration were scattered across various outposts, their eyes hollow from the strain of fighting an enemy that never seemed to tire. Lena felt the weight of it all pressing down on her as they moved through the narrow pathways, dodging debris and the occasional glimpse of alien forces in the distance. They reached one of the outer posts where a small group of soldiers huddled together, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Among them, Lena spotted Karis, a woman she had trained with back on Earth. Karis' once bright eyes were now clouded with fatigue and something else, something darker. Sean called out to the group, his voice low but commanding. "We need to reinforce the east side. They're pushing through again." Karis glanced up at him, her movements slow, almost mechanical. "Does it even matter anymore?" she asked, her voice flat. "We fight, we die, we come back, and then we do it all over again. What's the point?" Sean's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Lena stepped forward. "The point is survival," she said, her voice cutting through the growing despair. "We can't let them take this colony. If we lose this place, we lose everything." Karis stared at her for a long moment, then looked away, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Maybe we've already lost." Lena's chest tightened. She understood the feeling. It was the same sense of futility that had crept into her mind every time she looked at Evan. But she couldn't afford to let it take hold, not now. Not when there were still lives to save. "We haven't lost," Lena said, her voice firm. "Not yet." Sean gave her a sidelong glance, a hint of respect flickering in his eyes. He wasn't sure if she believed her own words, but for now, they needed something, anything to hold on to. They moved out toward the east side, joining the others in the trenches that had been dug along the perimeter of the colony. The alien forces were advancing again, their dark figures moving like shadows through the trees. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, mingling with the distant cries of the wounded. Lena and Sean took cover behind a low wall, their rifles aimed at the approaching figures. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of trust and uncertainty that had been forged in the heat of battle, but was still fragile. They had saved each other's lives more times than they could count. Yet there was an unspoken distance between them, a barrier neither was quite ready to cross. As the aliens closed in, Sean fired off a burst of rounds, taking down 2 of them with practiced precision. Lena followed suit, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The alien bodies crumpled to the ground, their strange, chitinous armor cracking under the impact of the bullets. For a brief moment, the tide seemed to turn in their favor. But then, without warning, one of the soldiers next to them, a man who had regenerated just hours before, let out a guttural scream. He dropped his weapon, clutching his head as if trying to tear something out of his mind. "They're in my head," he screamed, his voice raw with terror. I can't get them out." Sean swore under his breath, grabbing the man and pulling him back behind cover. The soldier thrashed violently, his eyes wide with panic. Lena could see the fear etched into his features, the same fear she had seen in Evan's eyes before he slipped into unconsciousness. "Calm down," Sean barked, trying to hold the man still. "You're safe here." But the soldier didn't respond. He continued to scream, his voice rising in pitch as he clawed at his own skin. It was as if his mind had fractured completely, unable to reconcile the trauma of dying and coming back to life. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She had seen this before, more times than she cared to admit. Each time, it became harder to watch. She wanted to help him, but she knew there was nothing she could do. The damage was already done. "We need to move," Sean said, his voice tight with urgency. "We can't stay here." Lena nodded, her throat dry. Together, they dragged the thrashing soldier back toward the colony, his screams echoing in the night. The battle raged on around them, but all Lena could think about was the growing cost of their so-called salvation. By the time they reached the relative safety of the colony's inner walls, the soldier had fallen silent. His body was still, his eyes wide open but unseeing. Lena checked his pulse, but it was faint, barely there. She knew he wouldn't last much longer. Sean sat down heavily beside her, his face etched with exhaustion. "This can't go on," he muttered, staring at the ground. "We're killing ourselves just as much as they are." Lena didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth of his words hung heavy in the air between them, a stark reminder of the cost they were all paying. She glanced at Sean, studying the lines of fatigue etched into his face. They had been through so much together, relying on each other for survival in ways that went beyond the battlefield. Yet even as they fought side by side, there was a distance between them, a wall neither had been willing to breach. But in that moment, as they sat together in the dim light of the colony's makeshift infirmary, Lena felt something shift. The weight of their shared experiences, the countless times they had saved each other's lives, had forged a bond between them that went beyond mere survival. "We'll get through this," Lena said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "We have to." Sean looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions: fear, anger, hope. For a moment, it seemed as though he might say something, but then he simply nodded. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the world pressing down on them both. Outside, the battle continued, but for now, all they could do was hold on to the fragile bond they had forged in the fires of war. Lena stared at the distant horizon, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The battles would continue, the regenerations would keep happening, and the toll on their minds and bodies would only grow heavier. But in that quiet moment, she found a small spark of hope. Perhaps, in the end, it wasn't the fighting that would save them. Perhaps it was the bonds they formed, the connections they made in the face of overwhelming odds, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep them going. Lena stared at the gray horizon, her thoughts scattered like the dust that swirled outside the makeshift infirmary. It had been weeks since they'd first encountered the rumors, whispers of a rogue faction of humans allying themselves with alien forces. And now, the rumors were reality, far worse than anything they'd imagined. It wasn't just an alliance, it was a deal with the devil. Chancellor Kryler had offered them the one thing that no human, no matter their station, could refuse: access to the secret of regeneration, the one power that had kept the alien forces dominant for so long. It wasn't just the possibility of immortality that had shaken her, but the fact that Kryler had offered it to humans who had once been their allies, now fragmented and disillusioned. The rogue faction had turned their backs on the human government, on Earth, out of frustration, anger, and a deepening sense of futility. Kryler had known exactly where to strike, exploiting the fractures within humanity's ranks with surgical precision. Lena felt the weight of it all settling on her chest, a heaviness that seemed to grow with each passing hour. She glanced over at Sean, sitting silently across the room, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He'd been like that ever since they'd received the news, caught in a struggle that went beyond their current mission. His loyalty, once so clear, seemed to be unraveling, and Lena wasn't sure whether to trust him or herself anymore. They had fought side by side through hell and back, yet something had shifted between them, something that had been brewing beneath the surface for far too long. In the quiet of the infirmary, Lena felt that tension building, a silent pressure that neither of them dared address directly. She knew what needed to be done, but the path forward had never been less certain. Chancellor Kryler's proposal had been simple. The alien leader had played the role of diplomat with unnerving ease, his voice smooth and persuasive as he made his case to the rogue human faction. All he needed in exchange was access to key human military strategies, intelligence on Earth's defenses, and the support of their human allies in key battlegrounds across the galaxy. And in return, Kryler would unlock the secret of regeneration for the chosen few, those deemed worthy by his alien council. It was a tempting offer, one that had already swayed more humans than Lena cared to think about. The rogue faction had seized it without hesitation, driven by a growing sense of bitterness toward the human government's indecision and faltering leadership. They had grown tired of watching Earth struggle, of seeing their people suffer without clear direction. To them, the alliance with Kryler wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Lena knew better. Kryler was playing a long game, one where humanity's best interests were merely pawns in a larger, more dangerous chess match. She could feel the stakes rising, but the human government, already fractured and overwhelmed, seemed blind to the growing threat. And now, Lena and Sean had been tasked with navigating the political minefield that had opened before them. The mission was clear: stop Kryler's plan before it gained more traction. But the means to do it were anything but. The lines between loyalty and betrayal were blurring faster than Lena could keep up with, and the fragility of the alliances they once relied on was becoming painfully obvious. That night, Lena and Sean sat in the small war room, surrounded by holo displays of data feeds and intelligence reports. The dim blue glow from the screens cast shadows across their faces as they both studied the latest transmissions from Kryler's camp. "We're losing them," Sean said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but steady, though Lena could sense the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Lena nodded, not taking her eyes off the screen in front of her. "Kryler knows exactly what he's doing. He's exploiting every weakness we have, every political fracture, every doubt in our leadership. He's counting on us to fall apart from the inside." Sean leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "And it's working. The rogue faction. They believe this is their only option. They think the government's too weak to fight back." "Maybe they're not wrong," Lena said softly. "The Council hasn't exactly inspired confidence lately. We've lost too many battles, made too many compromises. It's no wonder people are starting to question who they should be loyal to." Sean turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face for something in answer, maybe, or a sense of certainty that neither of them could provide. "And what about us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where does that leave us?" Lena hesitated, the question hitting her harder than she expected. She had always thought of loyalty as something solid, unshakable. But now, in the face of everything they'd been through, she wasn't sure what it meant anymore. Trust had become a currency in short supply, and even between them, the bonds felt strained. "I don't know," she admitted after a long pause. "I want to believe that we're doing the right thing, that we're still fighting for something that matters. But every day, it gets harder to see the line between right and wrong." Sean nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "It's not just about what's right anymore," he said, his voice laced with a quiet bitterness. "It's about survival. People are making deals with the devil because they don't see any other way out." "And you?" Lena asked, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you see?" Sean looked away, his gaze distant. "I see a galaxy that's tearing itself apart, and I see us, caught in the middle of it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and unacknowledged truths. Lena wanted to press him, to ask the questions that had been gnawing at her since this mission began, but something held her back. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear the answers. Instead, she focused on the task at hand. "We need to find a way to turn this around," she said, her voice firmer now. "We can't let Kryler win. If he gets access to our military strategies, if more humans defect to his side, it's over." Sean didn't respond right away, his mind clearly elsewhere. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, almost resigned. "It might already be too late." Lena turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "You don't really believe that, do you?" He didn't answer, but the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. The rogue faction was holed up on a remote moon in the Outer Rim, far from the reach of Earth's dwindling fleet. Lena and Sean's mission was to infiltrate their ranks, gather intel on their dealings with Kryler, and if possible, sabotage the alliance before it could solidify. It was a dangerous mission, perhaps suicidal, but it was their only option. As they prepared for departure, the tension between them continued to grow. Lena could feel it every time their eyes met, every time Sean hesitated before speaking. There was something he wasn't telling her, something that gnawed at the edges of their already fragile trust. They boarded the small reconnaissance ship in silence, the weight of the mission hanging heavy between them. The journey to the rogue faction's hideout was long and uneventful, giving Lena too much time to think. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer about Sean, about Kryler, about the rogue humans who had chosen to betray their own kind. As they neared their destination, the planet loomed large in the viewport, its surface dark and foreboding. Lena felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She had always known this mission would be dangerous, but now, faced with the reality of it, the stakes felt impossibly high. They landed in a remote clearing, well outside the rogue faction's main base of operations. As they disembarked, Lena glanced over at Sean, trying to gauge his mood. He seemed calm, focused, but she knew him well enough to see the cracks in his facade. "We'll go in under the guise of defectors," Sean said, his voice low and controlled. "Once we're inside, we'll need to blend in, gather as much intel as we can, and then get out before anyone realizes who we really are." Lena nodded, her mind already racing with possible scenarios. It was a risky plan, but it was the best they had. As they made their way toward the base, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rogue faction's camp was too quiet, too orderly. It didn't feel like a group of disillusioned humans scrambling for survival. It felt like something else entirely, something more calculated. When they reached the entrance to the base, a pair of guards stopped them, their expressions cold and unwelcoming. "State your business," one of them barked. Sean stepped forward, his voice steady. "We're here to join the cause." The guard eyed them suspiciously, his hand hovering near the weapon at his side. "You got proof?" Sean reached into his pocket and produced a small data chip. "We've got intel on Earth's defense grid. It's yours if you let us in." The guard took the chip, examining it for a moment before nodding. "All right, but don't try anything funny. We've got eyes everywhere." They were led inside, the door closing behind them with a heavy thud. As they entered the dimly lit corridors of the base, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they had just walked into a trap. The metallic door clanged shut behind Lena and Sean, sealing them inside the rogue faction's base. The faint echo faded into the dim corridors, leaving only the sound of their boots on the cold, polished floor. The air was dense, heavy with the weight of secrets, and Lena felt the knot of tension in her chest tighten with each step. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The guards had walked off, leaving them alone in a narrow passage lit by strips of flickering lights. Lena's eyes traced the path ahead, but her mind was somewhere else. This wasn't the first time she'd found herself in enemy territory, But something about this place, the careful, calculated order, the eerie quiet, unnerved her. She glanced at Sean, his face impassive, unreadable. He'd always been good at hiding what he was feeling, keeping his emotions buried beneath that stoic exterior. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight furrow in his brow as he glanced around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. She wanted to ask him if he felt it too, the strange, unsettling stillness, but something held her back. Maybe it was the distance that had grown between them over the past few weeks, a silent chasm neither of them had acknowledged yet. As they moved deeper into the base, Lena's thoughts drifted to the mission, to the endless calculations running through her mind. The stakes had never been higher, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here than they understood. Kryler's alliance with the rogue humans, the promise of regeneration, none of it felt like a simple power grab. There was something deeper, something darker beneath the surface, and Lena couldn't help but feel that they were walking straight into the heart of it. They reached an intersection, the corridor splitting in two directions. Sean hesitated for a moment before nodding to the left. Lena followed, her mind still racing, still turning over every possibility. But with each step, her thoughts began to shift, to pull her backward into the past, into the memories she had long tried to bury. She hadn't always been a soldier. There had been a time, before the war, before the endless cycle of violence and betrayal, when she believed in something different. When the world had seemed simpler, clearer. But that world was gone now, burned away by the fires of war and the choices she had made. Lena's childhood had been spent on a colony world far from Earth. Her father had been a military man, stern but loving, and her mother had been a diplomat, a woman of grace and intellect who had always believed in the power of diplomacy over violence. Lena had inherited her mother's sharp mind and her father's stubborn determination, a combination that had often led to friction in their household. She remembered the arguments, the long nights when her father would return from missions, his face hardened by the things he had seen, the things he couldn't talk about. Her mother had always tried to keep the peace, to smooth over the cracks in their family, but even she couldn't stop the growing divide between them. Lena had been caught in the middle, torn between her father's rigid sense of duty and her mother's idealism. But it was her mother's death that had changed everything. The day had started like any other. Lena had been 12, sitting at the kitchen table, reading through a stack of diplomatic reports her mother had brought home from work. Her mother had always encouraged her curiosity, had always pushed her to ask questions, to think critically about the world. But that morning, something had been different. Her mother had been distracted, her mind elsewhere as she prepared for a meeting with the colonial governor. Lena had sensed the tension in the air, but she hadn't understood it. Not until later, when the news came, a terrorist attack, an explosion at the governor's office. Her mother hadn't survived. The grief had been overwhelming, a tidal wave that had crushed everything in its path. Her father had withdrawn, retreating into himself, unable to cope with the loss. And Lena had been left alone, her mother's ideals shattered, her world turned upside down. It was then that she had made her decision. She would follow in her father's footsteps, join the military, fight for something, anything to fill the void that her mother's death had left behind. It hadn't been an easy path, but it had given her a sense of purpose, a way to channel her pain into something tangible. And yet, as the years passed, as the wars dragged on, Lena had begun to question whether it had been the right choice. Now, standing in the heart of the rogue faction's base, surrounded by the shadows of betrayal and uncertainty, those doubts came rushing back. Sean had his own demons. He hadn't spoken much about his past, but Lena knew enough to piece together the fragments. He'd been raised in one of the alien empires, far from Earth, in a culture that had always feared humans. The aliens had seen humanity's potential for violence, their capacity for destruction, and had tried to contain it, to control it. But Sean had never fit into that mold. He had always been different, always questioning the system he had been born into. He had defected to humanity's side years ago, after a series of events he had never fully explained. Lena suspected it had something to do with the way the alien empire had treated its human subjects, with the way they had tried to suppress their individuality, their spirit. Sean had always been fiercely independent, always driven by a desire for freedom. It was what had drawn him to the human cause in the first place. But now, as they walked deeper into the heart of enemy territory, Lena wondered if that desire for freedom was enough to keep him loyal. She had seen the way he looked at the rogue faction, the way he hesitated before speaking. She had seen the conflict in his eyes, the doubt that had begun to creep in. And she wasn't sure if he would stay with her when it mattered most. They reached the central chamber of the base, a large, circular room with a high ceiling and rows of computer terminals lining the walls. The rogue faction's leader, a man named Raylan, stood at the center of the room, his back to them as he studied a series of holographic projections. He didn't turn as they approached, his focus entirely on the data in front of him. "You're late," Raylan said, his voice calm but edged with authority. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your minds." Sean stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We had to make sure we weren't followed," he said, his tone measured. "The Council's spies are everywhere." Raylan nodded, still not turning to face them. "Of course, it's always wise to be cautious." Lena studied Raylan, her mind racing with questions. He had once been a respected officer in the human military, a man known for his strategic brilliance. But something had changed. Something had driven him to abandon his post and join the rogue faction. She wondered what it had been what had pushed him to betray everything he had once stood for. "Do you have what we asked for?" Raylan asked, finally turning to face them. His eyes were sharp, calculating, as he looked between Lena and Sean. Sean nodded, producing the data chip from his pocket. "Everything you need. Earth's defense grid, troop movements, supply lines, it's all there." Raylan took the chip, his expression unreadable as he examined it. "Good," he said after a moment. "This will be very useful." Lena felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she forced it down. This was part of the plan. They had to gain Raylan's trust, had to play the part of defectors if they were going to gather the information they needed. But the longer she stood in that room, the more she questioned whether they were doing the right thing. Raylan was no longer the man he had once been. He had become something else, something dangerous, and Lena wasn't sure if they could stop him before it was too late. Later, in the quiet of their assigned quarters, Lena sat on the edge of the narrow bunk, her mind still racing with everything that had happened. She hadn't spoken to Sean since their meeting with Raylan, and the silence between them felt heavier than ever. She glanced over at him, standing by the small window that overlooked the barren landscape outside. He hadn't moved in what felt like hours, his gaze fixed on something distant, something Lena couldn't see. "We're in deeper than I thought," Lena said finally, breaking the silence. Sean didn't turn to face her. "We always were." Lena frowned, frustration bubbling up inside her. "You don't seem worried." "I've been in worse situations." "That's not the point." Sean sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I know what you're thinking, Lena. I know you're questioning whether we're on the right side of this. But we don't have a choice. Kryler's alliance with the rogue faction, it's bigger than just us. It's bigger than Earth. If we don't stop them now, everything we've fought for will be lost." Lena shook her head. "And what if we've already lost? What if this mission, what if all of it is just a distraction? What if the real battle is somewhere else, and we're wasting our time here?" Sean finally turned to face her, his expression serious. "You don't believe that." "I don't know what I believe anymore." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their unspoken fears hung heavy in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the uncertainty that had come to define their lives. Finally, Sean spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "We can't change the past, Lena. We can only keep moving forward." Lena stared at him, searching for anything that would give her a sense of clarity. But all she found was the same doubt, the same questions that had haunted her since the beginning. And in that moment, she realized that there were no easy answers, only the choices they made and the consequences they would have to live with. The sound of distant explosions rumbled through the base, a low, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Lena's fingers tightened around the edge of the narrow bunk, her mind racing as she listened to the growing chaos outside. Sean had said it was only a matter of time before Kryler and the rogue faction moved. But she hadn't expected it to happen so soon, hadn't expected it to feel like this, so sudden, so close. She rose from the bunk, her movements sharp, determined, as she crossed the room to where Sean still stood by the window. His face was cast in shadow, his body tense as he stared out at the barren landscape. Lena didn't need to ask if he'd heard the same thing she had. The look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "It started," she said quietly, though the words felt unnecessary. Sean's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. His silence spoke volumes, a silence that, over the past few weeks, had become increasingly familiar. Lena had come to expect it from him, especially in moments like these when the weight of their choices pressed down on them both. "We need to move," Sean said finally, his voice low, controlled. "If we're caught in here when the attack hits, we'll be trapped." Lena nodded, already reaching for her gear, her mind shifting into the cold, calculated focus that had kept her alive through countless battles. But there was something different about this one, something more personal. The rogue faction had been an abstract threat for so long, a distant menace lurking in the shadows. Now they were here, and they were targeting her people, her colony. She strapped on her vest, the familiar weight grounding her as she glanced at Sean. He was already moving, his movements fluid and efficient as he prepared for whatever came next. They both knew what was at stake, knew that this battle would be unlike any they had fought before. "We need to warn them," Lena said, her voice steady but urgent. "The colony, they're not ready for this." Sean glanced at her, a flicker of something passing across his face before he nodded. "We'll get to the communications hub. It's our best shot at getting a message through before the attack hits full force." The plan was simple, direct. It had to be. There was no time for anything else. But even as they moved through the base, navigating the dimly lit corridors with the ease of soldiers who had spent years in the field, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The base felt too quiet, too empty. It was as if the storm was building around them. But they were standing in the eye, unaware of the full scale of the destruction that was about to hit. The comms room was situated on the far side of the base, a small, nondescript chamber filled with outdated equipment. It was a relic of a time before the war had consumed everything, before the lines between allies and enemies had blurred beyond recognition. Lena worked quickly, her fingers flying over the controls as she tried to establish a secure line to the colony. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like a lifetime as the screen blinked, loading, searching. "Come on. Come on." Finally, the screen flickered to life, and the face of Commander Rayla appeared, her features tense, her expression grim. "Lena, what's happening?" Rayla's voice was sharp, cutting through the static of the connection. "There's no time to explain," Lena said, her tone urgent. "Kryler's forces are moving on the colony. They've aligned with the rogue faction, and they're coming for us. You need to prepare for an assault. Now." Rayla's eyes widened, but to her credit, she didn't waste time with questions. "Understood. We'll begin evacuation protocols immediately. What's your status?" "We're still inside the base," Sean said, stepping forward. "But we won't be here for long. We'll make our way back to the colony and help where we can." Rayla hesitated, her gaze flicking between them. "It's going to be a bloodbath, Lena. If Kryler's bringing alien tech to the fight, we're outgunned." Lena's chest tightened at the words. She knew Rayla was right. The rogue faction had been bolstered by Kryler's alien allies, their technology far more advanced than anything the colony had access to. This wasn't going to be a fight for victory. It was going to be a fight for survival. "Do what you can, Rayla," Lena said, her voice quieter now, more measured. "We'll be there soon." The connection cut off, the screen going black, and for a moment, the room felt unnaturally still. Lena let out a slow breath, her thoughts spinning. There was no going back now. The battle was coming, and they were running out of time. The journey back to the colony was a blur of movement and tension. Sean and Lena moved through the desolate landscape with the precision of soldiers who had fought their way out of impossible situations before, but there was no denying the unease that clung to them like a shadow. The sky above was dark, heavy with the smoke of distant fires, and the air carried a metallic tang that made Lena's skin prickle. They moved quickly, their boots kicking up dust as they crossed the rugged terrain, the sound of distant explosions growing louder with each step. The colony came into view just as the first wave of Kryler's forces hit. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she watched the rogue faction's ships descend from the sky, sleek and deadly, their hulls glowing with alien energy. The ground shook as the ships unleashed their payloads, explosions ripping through the colony's defenses. It was chaos, pure and unrelenting, as the battle for survival began in earnest. "Get to the eastern perimeter," Sean shouted over the din, his voice barely audible above the roar of the battle. "They're hitting us hard from that side." Lena nodded, her body already moving before the words had fully registered. Her instincts had taken over, the training ingrained in her muscles as she sprinted toward the eastern perimeter. The sounds of gunfire and explosions filled the air, mingling with the shouts of soldiers and the distant screams of civilians. The perimeter was a mess of smoke and debris by the time Lena reached it. The colony's defensive lines were barely holding, the hastily assembled militia struggling to keep Kryler's forces at bay. Lena threw herself into the fight without hesitation, her weapon a blur as she fired into the advancing enemy ranks. It was brutal, chaotic. The rogue faction's soldiers moved with a precision and efficiency that spoke of years of training, their armor gleaming with the alien tech that had given them an edge. But for all their advantages, they weren't invincible. They bled, they fell, and Lena was determined to make sure they paid for every inch of ground they took. She fought with a single-minded focus, her mind a whirlwind of strategy and instinct. She couldn't afford to think about the bigger picture, couldn't afford to let herself be overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening. All that mattered in that moment was survival, hers, Sean's, the colony's. But as the battle raged on, as the hours stretched into an eternity of violence and bloodshed, Lena began to realize that survival might not be enough. Sean was somewhere to her left, holding the line with a group of militia fighters. His movements were efficient, methodical, as he took down one enemy after another. But even from a distance, Lena could see the strain in his posture, the exhaustion beginning to wear at the edges of his control. They were losing. It wasn't just the numbers, though they were outnumbered. Badly, it was the sheer overwhelming force of Kryler's attack. The rogue faction's soldiers fought with a brutality that bordered on reckless, their determination fueled by the alien technology that coursed through their veins. For every one they took down, two more seemed to take their place, their advance relentless, unyielding. Lena's arms ached from the constant recoil of her weapon, her muscles screaming in protest as she fought to keep up. Sweat dripped down her face, stinging her eyes, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not while there was still a chance, no matter how slim, that they could turn the tide. But then, through the smoke and chaos, Lena saw something that made her blood run cold. At the far end of the battlefield, standing amidst the carnage like a specter of death, was Kryler. He was tall, his frame imposing, his armor gleaming with an otherworldly light. His eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a cold, alien intelligence, and the air around him seemed to crackle with energy. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if the chaos of the battle was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. And behind him, following in his wake, was a group of rogue soldiers, their bodies enhanced by the same alien technology that had given Kryler his power. They were faster, stronger, more lethal than anything Lena had ever faced before. For the first time in a long time, Lena felt a flicker of fear. "Sean," she shouted, her voice hoarse from the smoke and dust. "We need to fall back." Sean's head snapped in her direction, his eyes widening as he caught sight of Kryler. There was no hesitation in his movements as he signaled to the militia fighters, ordering them to retreat. But as they began to pull back, Kryler raised his hand, and the ground beneath them erupted in a blinding flash of light. Lena was thrown backward, her body slamming into the ground with a force that knocked the air from her lungs. For a moment, the world was nothing but pain and noise, her vision blurred, her ears ringing. When she finally managed to push herself to her feet, the sight that greeted her was one of pure devastation. The eastern perimeter was gone, reduced to rubble and ashes. The blinding flash of Kryler's attack still burned in Lena's mind as she dragged herself from the rubble. Smoke and dust clouded her vision, the air thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and scorched earth. Her ears rang from the explosion, and every movement sent jolts of pain through her battered body, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not with everything hanging in the balance. She wiped the dirt from her face, squinting through the chaos to find Sean. He was only a few feet away, struggling to his feet, his expression a mix of anger and grim determination. Around them, the remnants of the militia were pulling back, retreating in disarray as Kryler's forces advanced. They were losing ground fast. But even in the midst of the carnage, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a hesitation in the rogue soldiers' movements, a ripple of uncertainty that spread through their ranks. Kryler's iron grip on them was faltering, the cracks in his alliance beginning to show. Lena could feel it, a shift in the air, like the tremors that precede an earthquake. She had always known this alliance between the rogue faction and the aliens was fragile, built on fear and greed. Now, that fragile foundation was starting to crumble. Sean limped toward her, his face grim. "We need to regroup. Find cover. This isn't a fight we can win out in the open." Lena nodded, the pain in her body momentarily forgotten as adrenaline took over. Together, they moved, slipping through the smoke and debris, ducking behind what little remained of the colony's defenses. The ground was slick with blood, the sounds of battle deafening in their intensity. But through it all, Lena's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered over the past weeks. The rogue faction had always been unpredictable, their loyalty to Kryler tenuous at best. They had aligned with him for power, for survival. But now that survival was slipping from their grasp, Kryler's control over them, once absolute, was faltering. Greed and fear had begun to poison the alliance, and Lena knew it was only a matter of time before it shattered completely. They just had to survive long enough to exploit that weakness. Hours passed in a blur of skirmishes, the tide of battle ebbing and flowing as the colony's defenders fought desperately to hold their ground. Lena and Sean led a small group of survivors through the broken remains of the eastern perimeter, using every scrap of cover they could find as Kryler's forces advanced. The rogue soldiers fought with a terrifying efficiency, their bodies enhanced by alien technology. But there was something in their eyes, a hesitation, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. Lena clung to that doubt like a lifeline. They took refuge in the shell of a half-collapsed building, the walls scorched black from the earlier explosions. The air was thick with dust, and the distant sounds of battle echoed in the background. It was a brief reprieve, but Lena knew it wouldn't last. Sean was pacing, his movements restless, his eyes flicking between the survivors huddled in the shadows. "We're running out of options, Lena," he said, his voice low but edged with frustration. "Kryler's got us boxed in. We can't hold them off forever." Lena leaned against the wall, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. He was right. They were running out of time. But there was something else gnawing at the edges of her mind, something she hadn't fully allowed herself to consider until now. The regeneration technology. It had been a closely guarded secret, something only a handful of people in the colony knew about. A breakthrough in bioengineering, capable of repairing even the most grievous injuries, restoring life where there had once been none. It had the potential to change the course of the war if it could be used properly. But that was the problem. The technology was incomplete, unstable. It was designed to heal, to save lives, but it could just as easily be weaponized. Lena had seen the preliminary data how the same technology that could regenerate cells could also accelerate decay, turning it into a tool of destruction. It was a double-edged sword, and using it in battle would have consequences unforeseen, uncontrollable consequences. She glanced at Sean, his face hard with the weight of their losses. He didn't know about the technology. No one outside of the core research team did. But if they were going to survive this, if they were going to have any chance of defeating Kryler, Lena knew she would have to make a choice. Save a few or risk everything to win the war. The implications of that choice sent a chill down her spine. The night stretched on, the flickering flames of the battle casting long shadows across the ruined landscape. Lena sat in the darkness, her thoughts tangled as the weight of the decision pressed down on her. Sean was resting, his back against the wall, his eyes closed in a rare moment of stillness. The other survivors were scattered throughout the building, their faces pale with exhaustion, their bodies slumped against the cold, hard ground. There was a stillness in the air, a fragile, uneasy peace that threatened to shatter at any moment. Lena turned the small data pad over in her hands, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light. The regeneration technology was stored on it, a blueprint for hope or for destruction. She stared at it for a long time, her mind torn between two equally impossible choices. She could use the technology now, deploy it in the field, and potentially turn the tide of the battle. It could save lives, maybe even give them the edge they needed to push Kryler back. But the risks were too great. There was no telling what kind of damage it could cause, no guarantee that it wouldn't spiral out of control, turning the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. Or she could keep it locked away, protect it from being used as a weapon, and let the battle play out as it would. Let fate decide who lived and who died. Lena's chest tightened at the thought. She had always believed in the morality of power, in the idea that just because you could do something didn't mean you should. But this was different. This wasn't just about winning a war. It was about survival. And in a fight for survival, were there any lines that couldn't be crossed? She thought of the people who had already died, soldiers, civilians, men and women who had fought to protect their home, their families. She thought of Rayla, back at the colony, rallying what remained of their forces, holding out hope that somehow they could still win. And she thought of Kryler, his cold, alien eyes burning with the certainty of victory. His alliance with the rogue faction was crumbling, but it wasn't gone yet. If they didn't act soon, if they didn't find a way to tip the balance, Kryler would win. He would crush them all, and the colony would fall. Lena's fingers tightened around the datapad. What was the cost of victory? And more importantly, what was the cost of doing nothing? The next morning, Lena made her way through the smoldering remains of the battlefield. The sky was a dull, ash gray, the air thick with a scent of smoke and death. The fighting had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. Kryler's forces were regrouping, preparing for another assault. They had lost ground, but they were far from defeated. Lena moved quickly, her steps sure and deliberate as she crossed the broken terrain. The survivors had regrouped at the western edge of the colony, where the defenses were still holding. It was a fragile line, but it was all they had left. Sean was already there when she arrived, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He glanced at her as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Any word from Rayla?" Lena asked, her voice tight. Sean shook his head. "Nothing yet, but it's only a matter of time. Kryler's gearing up for another attack. We need to be ready." Lena nodded, her mind racing. The decision was still gnawing at her, a constant, unrelenting presence in the back of her mind. But there was no more time for hesitation, no more time for doubt. She handed the data pad to Sean. "What's this?" he asked, frowning as he took it from her. "It's our last chance," Lena said, her voice quiet but steady. "The regeneration technology. It could save us or destroy everything." Sean's eyes widened as he stared at the screen, realization dawning on him. "You're serious?" Lena nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I'm serious." For a long moment, Sean said nothing, his eyes flicking between the data pad and Lena's face. The weight of the decision hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging. "What are you going to do?" Lena stared out at the battlefield, her heart pounding in her chest. The decision was hers to make, and no one else's. She had to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. I don't know, she said quietly. But whatever happens, it won't be easy. Sean nodded, his expression grim. It never is. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a faint, golden light over the ruined landscape. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, Lena felt a strange sense of clarity. She didn't know what the future held, or what the cost of her decision would be. But she knew this. Sometimes, the hardest choices were the ones that mattered most. And in the end, perhaps it wasn't about winning or losing. Perhaps it was about the choices they made along the way, the choices that defined who they were, and what they stood for. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, Lena made her choice. The dawn that followed Kryler's defeat was hollow. A thin veil of smoke hung over the colony, its once proud walls now reduced to rubble. Every step Lena took through the wreckage felt heavier than the last, not just from the fatigue of battle, but from the gravity of what had been unleashed. The regeneration technology had saved lives, countless lives, but the cost was already being felt, seeping into the minds and hearts of those who had endured the process. She stopped near the collapsed remains of what had been the colony's central square, staring at the twisted, blackened remnants of buildings that once stood tall. A handful of survivors picked through the rubble, their movements slow and mechanical. There was no celebration of victory, no relief, only silence. The kind of silence that drags on, stretching far beyond the moment. It was the kind that made you question what had truly been won. Sean was behind her. She could feel him there. He hadn't said much since the final push to defeat Kryler. They had survived. They had driven the enemy out. But something between them had shifted. Lena hadn't even needed to speak with him to know. It was in the way he avoided her eyes, in the distance between them that had grown wider with each passing day. The regeneration technology had changed everything, and now it was changing them. 3 days passed, and the colony remained in ruins. Messages of victory were broadcast to the outer systems, but the people here, the ones who had fought and bled for this patch of land, felt nothing of the triumph that the rest of the galaxy seemed to celebrate. They had seen too much. Lena found herself walking alone most of the time, avoiding the communal spaces where survivors gathered. The conversations that filled those rooms had grown strange, unsettling in ways that were hard to put into words. The people who had undergone multiple rounds of regeneration weren't the same anymore. Their bodies had been restored, but something had been lost in the process, something intangible but undeniable. She had noticed it in their eyes, first how they seemed vacant, as if they were looking at the world from a distance, and then it was in their voices, the way they spoke of themselves as if they were no longer whole, no longer the person they had been before. It wasn't just a few of them. It was becoming widespread, a growing unease among those who had been brought back more than once. Lena caught snatches of their conversations as she passed by, words like fragmented, incomplete, disconnected. There were murmurs about identity, about what it meant to still be human after coming back from the brink of death so many times. And as those questions spread, so did the fear. Fear that they had tampered with something that should never have been touched. Fear that the people they once were gone, and what remained was something else entirely. Sean avoided those gatherings too. Lena had seen him, always at a distance, always with that same grim expression on his face. They hadn't spoken much since the final battle, but she knew what weighed on him. It was the same thing that haunted her. They had made a choice, and now they were living with it. Lena found Sean one morning, standing on the outskirts of the colony, staring out at the horizon where the sky met the desolate landscape. He didn't look up when she approached, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the present moment. "You've been quiet," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of all the unspoken words between them. Sean didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low, almost distant. "I've been thinking." Lena nodded, though he couldn't see it. She knew what that kind of thinking felt like, the kind that gnawed at you, that kept you awake at night. "About what?" He turned to her then, his eyes heavy with something deeper than exhaustion. "About whether we did the right thing." The question hung between them, stark and raw. It was a question Lena had asked herself every day since the battle ended. She had told herself that they had no choice, that using the regeneration technology had been necessary. But the truth was more complicated than that. "We saved people," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it once had. Sean's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Did we? Or did we just prolong things? What if we've only delayed the inevitable?" Lena didn't have an answer for that. She had seen the faces of those who had been regenerated too many times, seen the way they looked at the world now with a kind of detachment that was as unsettling as it was heartbreaking. They were alive, yes, but were they still the same people? Or had something fundamental been lost along the way? "Sean, we couldn't have known," she began, but he cut her off. "We did know, Lena. We knew there were risks. We knew the technology wasn't perfect, that there would be consequences, and we used it anyway." The silence that followed was suffocating. Lena stared at the ground, her mind racing, trying to find some justification, some way to make sense of everything that had happened. But there was none. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sean's gaze softened, and for the first time in days, he looked directly at her. "I don't know. All I know is that I can't stop thinking about what we've done, about the people who've come back. They're not the same. Lena, you've seen it too." She had, and it terrified her. The changes in the people who had undergone regeneration were subtle at first, but as time passed, they became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just their mannerisms or the way they spoke. It was deeper than that. Something fundamental to who they were had shifted. One evening, Lena sat with a group of survivors around a small fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The conversation turned to the topic of identity, as it so often did these days. One of the men, a soldier who had been regenerated 3 times, stared into the fire, his expression distant. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, his voice hollow. "Every time I come back, it feels like pieces of me are missing, like I'm being chipped away, little by little." The others nodded in solemn agreement. One woman spoke of memories that felt out of place, as if they belonged to someone else. Another described a growing numbness, an inability to connect with the world around her. Lena listened in silence, the weight of their words pressing down on her. She had seen the reports from the research team, had known the risks. But hearing it like this, seeing the impact it was having on real people, made it all the more real, and all the more horrifying. What had they done? The war was over, but the consequences of their victory were only beginning to unfold. The galaxy, still reeling from the chaos of Kryler's defeat, was starting to take notice of the regeneration technology. Whispers of immortality spread through the outer systems, and with them, rumors of the price that came with it. Lena received word from the outer colony's other factions were beginning to experiment with the technology, eager to replicate the success of their victory. But they didn't understand the cost. They didn't understand the danger. The process was still unstable, still prone to the same fragmentation that was now plaguing their people. She had tried to warn them, but the allure of immortality was too strong. The idea that death could be conquered, that they could be saved from the fragility of their own existence, blinded them to the truth. Lena knew better now. She knew that immortality came with a price, and it was a price too steep for any of them to pay. Weeks passed, and the strain on the colony grew. The survivors were divided, those who had undergone regeneration multiple times and those who hadn't. The rift between them was growing, a quiet but undeniable schism that threatened to tear them apart. The regenerated soldiers spoke of a disconnection, a feeling that they no longer belonged, not just to the colony, but to the human race itself. They were different now, changed in ways that couldn't be undone, and the others, the ones who hadn't undergone the process, began to fear them. Lena felt the tension building, felt the unspoken fear that hung in the air. It wasn't just about the technology anymore. It was about what it meant to be human. As she walked through the colony one evening, she overheard a conversation between 2 survivors, their voices low but urgent. "They're not like us," one of them said. "They've been altered. Who knows what they're capable of now?" "They don't even seem to care anymore," the other replied. It's like they're losing touch with reality, with what it means to be alive. Lena's stomach twisted as she listened. This was the beginning of something darker, something far more dangerous than the war they had just fought. This was the beginning of a fracture that could never be healed. That night, Lena sat alone, staring up at the stars. The vastness of the universe stretched out before her, cold and indifferent. For the first time in her life, she felt truly small, insignificant in the face of forces she could barely comprehend. She thought about the people they had saved, and the ones they had lost. She thought about the choices they had made, and the consequences they were now facing. And she thought about what it meant to be human in a world where death no longer had meaning. The stars offered no comfort. They had always been a symbol of hope for Lena, a reminder of the infinite possibilities that lay beyond their reach. But now, they felt distant, cold, like fragments of a dream that no longer mattered. Lena closed her eyes, trying to remember the person she had been before all of this, before the war, before the technology, before the choices that had changed everything. She had been so sure of herself then, so certain of what was right and what was wrong. But now, the lines were blurred, and the certainty she had once felt seemed like a distant memory. The quiet night was interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Sean. He had always moved with a kind of quiet grace, even when burdened by the weight of everything they had been through. He sat down beside her without a word, his presence a familiar but heavy one. They hadn't spoken much lately, but the silence between them was more than just a lack of words. It was the unspoken acknowledgement of the choices they had made, choices that could never be undone. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The night stretched on, the only sound the distant hum of the damaged colony, struggling to rebuild itself in the wake of destruction. Finally, it was Sean who broke the silence, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you ever wonder what we could have done differently?" Lena didn't answer right away. She had asked herself that question so many times over the past few weeks that the words had lost their meaning. What could they have done differently? Would anything have changed? "I don't know," she said after a long pause. "I think about it all the time. But we didn't have the luxury of choosing the perfect option. We had to make a decision in the moment, with lives on the line." Sean nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the stars. "But now we're paying for it." Lena glanced at him, her chest tightening. She could see the toll the war had taken on him, not just physically but mentally. He had always been the one to carry the weight of responsibility, to protect those around him. But now, that weight was crushing him. "We saved people, Sean," Lena said quietly. "We did what we had to do." "But at what cost?" he asked, his voice sharp with bitterness. "Look at them, Lena. Look at what we've done to them. They're not the same anymore. We've broken them." Lena looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She knew he was right. The people who had been regenerated were changed, not just in the ways they had anticipated, but in ways they hadn't been prepared for. They were alive, but they weren't whole. And that fracture, that loss of identity, was spreading through the colony like a disease. "They're losing themselves," Sean continued, his voice softening but still filled with anguish. "Every time they come back, they lose a little more of who they are. How long before there's nothing left?" Lena's throat tightened. She didn't have an answer for him. She didn't know how to fix what they had done. For a long time, they sat in silence again, the weight of their conversations settling between them like an invisible wall. The stars flickered overhead, distant and indifferent. "It's not just them, you know," Sean said after a while, his voice barely more than a murmur. "It's us too. We're not the same either." Lena turned to him, frowning. "What do you mean?" Sean met her gaze for the first time, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place: regret, fear, something deeper. "You and we've changed too. This war, the choices we've made, it's taken something from us. I can feel it. Can't you?" Lena stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't allowed herself to think about it before, hadn't wanted to admit that maybe he was right. But now, sitting here with him, the truth was impossible to ignore. I don't know who I am anymore, Sean continued, his voice breaking slightly. I look in the mirror, and I don't recognize myself. I've done things I never thought I'd be capable of, and I don't know if I can live with that. Lena felt a lump rise in her throat. She had seen the same changes in herself, the same doubts, but she had pushed them down, buried them deep beneath the surface. She couldn't afford to break, not now, not when so much was at stake. But hearing Sean say it out loud made it real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I feel it too. Sean exhaled, a long, shaky breath, as if some part of him had been holding on to that truth for too long. So what do we do? He asked, his voice quiet, almost pleading. Lena shook her head. I don't know. I don't have the answers. They sat in silence again, the weight of everything pressing down on them. Lena stared up at the stars, her mind racing. There had to be a way to fix this, to undo the damage they had caused. But every solution felt just as dangerous as the problem itself. After a long pause, Sean spoke again, his voice hesitant. Maybe we need to stop. Stop what? Lena asked, frowning. Stop using the regeneration technology. Stop bringing people back. Lena felt her heart skip a beat. The thought of stopping, of letting people die, was almost too much to bear. They had become so reliant on the technology, so dependent on the idea that death could be avoided, that the idea of letting go felt impossible. We can't just let people die, she said, her voice trembling. Can't we? Sean asked, his voice soft but insistent. Lena, look at what we've done. We've crossed a line, and now we're paying for it. Maybe death is a part of being human. Maybe it's not something we're supposed to cheat. Lena stared at him, her mind spinning. She wanted to argue, to tell him that they couldn't go back, that they had already made their choice. But deep down, she knew he was right. They had tampered with something they didn't fully understand, and now they were dealing with the consequences. In the weeks that followed, the colony grew more divided. The people who had undergone multiple regenerations began to distance themselves from the others, forming their own small groups, their own communities. The schism between the regenerates and the unaltered survivors widened, and tensions grew with each passing day. There were whispers of rebellion, of unrest, as the regenerated soldiers began to question their place in the colony. They felt different, alienated, as if they no longer belonged. And the others, the ones who hadn't been altered, began to fear them, to see them as something other, something dangerous. It was only a matter of time before that fear turned to violence. One evening, Lena was called to the medical bay. There had been a fight. One of the regenerated soldiers had been attacked by a group of survivors. The man had sustained severe injuries, but he was alive, thanks to the regeneration technology. But the incident was a sign of something darker brewing beneath the surface. Lena stood in the doorway of the medical bay, staring at the injured soldier as he lay unconscious on the table. His face was bruised and bloodied, his body broken, but he would recover. Physically, at least. Emotionally, mentally, that was another story. Sean was beside her, his expression grim. "This is only going to get worse," he said quietly. Lena nodded, her heart heavy. She knew he was right. The colony was on the verge of tearing itself apart, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. That night, Lena sat alone in her quarters, staring at the small, flickering light of the lamp on her desk. The weight of everything pressed down on her, suffocating, overwhelming. She had always been strong, always been able to carry the burden of leadership. But now, that strength was slipping away, replaced by doubt and fear. She thought about the people who had been regenerated, about the way they looked at the world, now with a kind of detachment that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. They were alive, yes, but they weren't the same. And neither was she. Lena reached for the small vial of pills on her desk, her fingers trembling as she unscrewed the cap. She had been taking them for weeks now, to help her sleep, to numb the constant ache of guilt and regret that gnawed at her every day. But tonight, she hesitated. Sean's words echoed in her mind, "Maybe death is a part of being human." Lena stared at the pills in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long trying to avoid death, trying to cheat it, that she had forgotten what it meant to be alive, to be human. Slowly, she set the pills down, her hand shaking. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't keep running from the consequences of their choices. It was time to face the truth. The next morning, Lena called a meeting with the colony's leaders. The room was filled with tension, the air thick with the weight of unspoken fears and doubts. Sean stood beside her, his expression grim but resolute. Lena took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "We need to stop using the regeneration technology." The room erupted into chaos, voices shouting in disbelief, anger, fear. But Lena stood her ground, her voice firm as she continued. "This technology, it's not what we thought it was. It's changing us, changing our people. We've crossed a line, and we can't go back. We need to let death be a part of life again." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Lena met the gaze of each person in the room, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "I know this is hard. I know it feels impossible. But we have to face the truth. We can't keep living like this. It's time to make a choice, a real choice." The room remained silent, the tension thick and suffocating. But Lena knew, in that moment, that they had reached a turning point. There was no going back now. That night, Lena stood outside, staring up at the stars once again. They still seemed distant, cold. But now, they also held a glimmer of something else, a fragile, tentative hope. For the first time in a long time, Lena felt something stir within her, a sense of possibility, of change. It wasn't certainty, but it was enough. And for now, that was all she needed. The day after the decision to halt the use of regeneration technology marked the beginning of a new chapter for Lena and Sean. The immediate aftermath of the announcement was a storm of conflicting emotions and reactions from the colony. The tension in the air was palpable as the leaders and citizens grappled with the reality of their choices. Lena found herself walking through the remains of what had once been a bustling hub of activity. Now it was a landscape of rubble and quiet. The rebuilding process had begun, but the scars of the past lingered like ghosts, haunting every corner. The colony was struggling to reclaim its sense of normalcy, but the damage was more than just physical. The psychological toll of the war and the subsequent disillusionment with the regeneration technology had left a deep imprint on the people. She came to a stop near a small group of survivors working to clear debris from what had been the marketplace. They worked in silence, their faces set in determined but weary lines. Lena approached them, offering a few words of encouragement, but the response was muted. She could see the strain in their eyes, the exhaustion of trying to piece together their lives after the upheaval. Sean was nearby, coordinating the logistics of the rebuilding effort. His usual calm demeanor was strained, his face etched with worry lines. He was immersed in a conversation with a group of engineers and planners, trying to figure out how to restore the essential infrastructure while balancing the needs of the population. As Lena approached, she saw him pause, taking a deep breath before continuing with the discussion. Their eyes met briefly, and Lena could see the shared burden of their roles. They had both become symbols of hope and resilience, but the weight of leadership was heavier than they had anticipated. The decisions they made now would shape the future of their world and their people, but the path forward was fraught with challenges. Later that day, Lena and Sean gathered with the key representatives of the coalition they had formed. The meeting was held in a makeshift conference room, a far cry from the sleek, well-appointed spaces of their past. The room was filled with tension, the representatives' faces a mixture of skepticism and wariness. The alliance they had built was fragile, and the recent events had only heightened the unease among the various factions. Lena stood at the head of the table, her posture rigid as she addressed the assembly. "We are at a crossroads," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. The decision to stop using the regeneration technology was not made lightly. It was a choice born out of necessity, but it has far-reaching implications for our future. The representatives shifted in their seats, their murmurs reflecting the underlying tension. One of the leaders, a tall, imposing figure with sharp features, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Lena. "And what of the alien factions? How do we address their concerns and fears?" Lena took a deep breath, knowing that the question was a significant one. "We must approach them with honesty and transparency. We must show them that we are committed to rebuilding and forging a new path forward. We must also be prepared to address their concerns about the technology and its implications." The room was silent for a moment before another representative spoke up. "But what if they seek to exploit the technology for their own gain? We've already seen how dangerous it can be in the wrong hands." Lena's heart sank at the mention of exploitation. She had feared that the technology, even with its use suspended, would continue to be a point of contention. "We will need to establish safeguards and protocols to prevent misuse. We must work with our allies to ensure that the technology is not used for purposes that could jeopardize our efforts to maintain peace." Sean stepped in, his voice firm but calm. "It is also crucial that we strengthen our diplomatic efforts. We need to build trust and work towards common goals. We cannot afford to let fear and suspicion drive us apart." The conversation continued, each representative voicing their concerns and suggestions. Lena and Sean listened carefully, taking note of the various perspectives. The discussions were intense, reflecting the complexity of the situation they faced. The fragile peace they sought to build was a delicate balance, and every decision they made had the potential to shift that balance. After the meeting, Lena and Sean retreated to their quarters, the weight of the day's discussions hanging heavily between them. The quiet of their space was a stark contrast to the turmoil outside. Lena sat down at the small table, her hands clasped tightly as she tried to collect her thoughts. Sean joined her, his expression contemplative. "It's going to be a long road," he said quietly. "We have so many hurdles to overcome, and the trust we need to build is not something that will happen overnight." Lena nodded, feeling the strain of the responsibility they had taken on. "I know, and there's also the issue of dealing with the emotional scars. People are still grappling with what happened. It's more than just rebuilding structures, it's about helping them heal." Sean sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We've seen what this technology has done to people. It's not just physical damage, it's psychological. We need to find a way to address that, to help them find some semblance of normalcy." Lena looked at him, her eyes reflecting the depth of her own concerns. "And what about us? How do we reconcile our own experiences with the demands of leadership? Sometimes I feel like we're losing ourselves in all of this." Sean's gaze softened as he met her eyes. "I think we have to remember why we started this journey. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day struggles, but we have to hold on to the core of what we believe in." Lena took a deep breath, trying to find solace in his words. "You're right. We have to stay true to our values, even when it's difficult. We can't let ourselves be consumed by the challenges." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling over them. The silence was punctuated by the faint hum of the colony's rebuilding efforts, a reminder of the work that lay ahead. As the days passed, Lena and Sean continued to navigate the delicate balance of rebuilding their world. The coalition began to take shape, with various factions coming together to address their common goals. The process was slow, but there were moments of progress that offered a glimmer of hope. Lena spent time meeting with leaders from different alien factions, working to build trust and address their concerns. The conversations were often tense, but Lena approached each one with patience and a willingness to listen. She knew that rebuilding relationships was as crucial as rebuilding the colony itself. Sean worked closely with the engineers and planners, overseeing the reconstruction of critical infrastructure. He also focused on establishing protocols to ensure the regeneration technology was used responsibly. The safeguards were designed to prevent misuse, but they were also a reminder of the power they had wielded and the responsibility that came with it. The emotional toll of their experiences remained a constant presence in their lives. Lena and Sean both struggled with their own doubts and fears, but they found solace in each other's company. Their relationship, though strained, was a source of support as they faced the challenges ahead. One evening, as they walked through the partially restored areas of the colony, Lena glanced at Sean, her thoughts reflecting on the journey they had been through. "We've come a long way," she said quietly, "but it feels like we're only just beginning." Sean nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We've achieved a lot, but there's still so much to do. The road to peace is long and winding, and we have to be prepared for the challenges that lie ahead." Lena sighed, looking out at the bustling activity of the colony. "I keep thinking about what it means to rebuild, to find hope in the midst of all this. Sometimes it feels like an insurmountable task." Sean took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It's not about achieving perfection. It's about making progress, no matter how small. Every step forward is a step towards a better future." Lena smiled, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "You're right. We have to keep moving forward, even when it's hard. We have to believe that we can make a difference." As they continued their walk, Lena and Sean found a sense of calm in the midst of the chaos. The stars overhead seemed to offer a promise of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was light to be found. The fragile peace they sought to build was a delicate balance, but it was one worth striving for. The scars of the past would always be there, but they were also a testament to their resilience and their commitment to creating a better future. In the end, Lena and Sean knew that their journey was far from over. The challenges they faced were significant, but they were not insurmountable. As they looked towards the future, they held on to the belief that they could overcome the obstacles in their path and build a world where peace and hope could thrive. The fragile peace they sought was not just a goal. It was a journey, a process of healing and rebuilding that required patience, perseverance, and unwavering dedication. And as they continued their work, Lena and Sean remained steadfast in their commitment to creating a better future for all.